Hello everyone, welcome back to Buried Files. Tonight we venture beyond the city lights into the forgotten corners of rural America with 8 chilling accounts that prove isolation breeds the darkest secrets. In this episode, we will journey through remote farmlands, abandoned backroads, and forgotten homesteads with 8 harrowing tales of countryside terror drawn from the authentic experiences of those who survived to share their stories. Each narrative has been meticulously documented from first-hand testimonies of individuals who witnessed horrors hidden in plain sight across America's heartland. To protect the identities of those brave enough to come forward, certain names and specific locations have been carefully altered while preserving the terrifying truth of their experiences. If you are new here, make sure to subscribe to Buried Files for spine-chilling true horror content that exposes the darkness lurking in unexpected places. Hit that notification bell so you never miss when we uncover the buried truths that others fear to speak. Drop a comment below and let us know which type of rural horror story disturbs you most, and do not forget to share your own countryside encounters if you dare. Now let us begin our descent into the isolated terror that awaits beyond the last streetlight. So this is actually my late grandfather's story, but I found his journal after we cleared out the old farmhouse. The entry was dated October 15, 1987, and it started with, "The Kowalski place has been empty for 3 years, but someone's been lighting fires in their kitchen every night this week." I never knew my grandfather kept a journal until we found it tucked inside his old tool chest, wrapped in plastic like it was some kind of treasure he needed to protect. My grandmother had passed 5 years earlier, and when we went through their belongings, most of it was just the usual stuff you'd expect from people who lived through the Depression. But this journal, this changed everything I thought I knew about the quiet man who taught me how to fix engines and never talked about his past. The Kowalski place sat about 2 miles down the gravel road from my grandparents' ranch, separated by nothing but rolling hills and barbed wire fencing that had seen better decades. According to what I learned from my grandmother years later, the Kowalskis had been decent neighbors for about 15 years. They kept to themselves mostly, raised a few head of cattle, and Mrs. Kowalski would bring over fresh bread every Christmas morning. Then one day in 1984, they just packed up and left. No goodbye, no forwarding address, just an empty house with the windows boarded up and weeds starting to claim the front porch. My grandfather wrote in his journal that he'd been noticing strange lights coming from the abandoned house for about a week before he decided to investigate. He described the lights as orange and flickering, definitely from the kitchen window, and they would appear every night around 9 o'clock and burn until sometime after midnight. He wrote that he'd mentioned it to my grandmother, but she insisted it was probably just teenagers using the place to party, or maybe someone passing through looking for shelter. But my grandfather had a different feeling about it, something that made his stomach turn every time he saw those lights dancing behind the dirty glass. On October 16th, the day after that first entry, my grandfather wrote that he'd walked over to the Kowalski place in broad daylight to get a better look. He brought his rifle, not because he was looking for trouble, but because out there in Wyoming you just never knew what kind of wildlife might have taken up residence in an abandoned building. When he got close to the house, he could smell something that reminded him of his time in Vietnam. Something he described as the smell of meat left too long in the sun but sweeter, like someone had tried to cover it up with perfume. The front door was still boarded up, but my grandfather noticed that the boards over the kitchen window had been removed and stacked neatly beside the house. The window itself was clean, cleaner than it had any right to be after 3 years of Wyoming weather. He wrote that he could see into the kitchen from where he stood, and everything looked exactly like the Kowalskis had left it. The table was still set for 2, with plates and silverware waiting for a meal that would never come. The old wood-burning stove sat in the corner, and my grandfather could see fresh ashes in the firebox. still warm to the touch when he reached through the window to check. That night, my grandfather positioned himself in his own kitchen with a pair of binoculars and waited. At exactly 9:15, the lights appeared again, but this time he could see more than just the flickering glow. According to his journal entry from October 17th, he watched two figures moving around the Kowalski kitchen, and they were definitely not teenagers or drifters looking for shelter. He described them as a man and a woman, both dressed in what looked like the same clothes the Kowalskis used to wear. The man had on overalls and a flannel shirt, while the woman wore a simple dress with an apron tied around her waist. My grandfather wrote that he watched them for over an hour, and they seemed to be going through the motions of preparing and eating dinner. They would sit at the table, lift forks to their mouths, and even appear to be having conversation. But something about their movements seemed wrong to him. He described it as watching actors who had forgotten their lines, going through the motions of a play they barely remembered. The strangest part was that he never saw them actually eat anything, despite the fact that they spent the entire time making the gestures of people sharing a meal. The next few journal entries document my grandfather's growing obsession with the lights in the Kowalski house. He started timing their appearances, noting that they showed up at exactly the same time every night and lasted for exactly the same duration. He also started paying attention to other details that he'd initially missed. The figures never seemed to acknowledge the outside world, never looked toward the windows, or acted like they were aware that anyone might be watching them. They also never seemed to bring any food into the house or take any dishes away when they finished their nightly routine. On October 22nd, my grandfather decided to get a closer look. He wrote that he'd been losing sleep over the whole situation and needed to know what was really happening in that kitchen. He waited until the figures appeared at their usual time, then crept across the field between the two properties, staying low and moving slowly to avoid being seen. When he got close enough to peer directly through the kitchen window, what he saw made him question his own sanity. The man and woman were sitting at the table just like he'd observed through his binoculars, but up close he could see that their faces were wrong. My grandfather struggled to describe exactly what he meant by this, but he wrote that their features seemed blurred, like someone had smudged a photograph before it dried. Their eyes were completely black, not just the pupils, but the entire visible portion. And when they moved their mouths as if speaking, no sound came out. Most disturbing of all, my grandfather could see that the plates in front of them held nothing but what looked like small piles of dirt and dead insects. My grandfather wrote that he watched in horror as the woman picked up a fork, stabbed it into the pile of dirt on her plate, and brought it to her mouth. She chewed methodically, dirt falling from the corners of her lips, while the man did the same with what appeared to be a collection of dead beetles and moths. They ate in complete silence, never acknowledging each other or showing any sign that they were aware of my grandfather's presence just outside their window. The journal entry from October 23rd reveals that my grandfather had barely slept the night before, and he'd started to wonder if he was having some kind of breakdown. He wrote that he'd considered talking to someone about what he'd seen, but he knew how crazy it would sound. Instead, he decided to document everything as carefully as possible, hoping that writing it down would help him make sense of the situation, or at least provide evidence if anyone ever questioned his mental state. That night, my grandfather returned to his observation post in his own kitchen, but this time he brought a camera. He'd managed to borrow a telephoto lens from a friend in town, and he was determined to get photographic evidence of whatever was happening in the Kowalski house. At exactly 9:15, the lights appeared as usual, and my grandfather started taking pictures. Through the camera lens, he could see the two figures more clearly than ever before, and what he saw convinced him that whatever was happening in that house had nothing to do with the living world. The figures moved with a jerky, unnatural rhythm, like marionettes being controlled by someone who wasn't quite sure how puppets were supposed to work. Their heads would snap from side to side at odd angles, and sometimes they would freeze in the middle of an action for several seconds before continuing. Most disturbing of all, my grandfather noticed that they cast no shadows, despite the fact that the kitchen was lit by what appeared to be candlelight from several sources. On October 25th, my grandfather wrote that he'd developed the photographs he'd taken and they showed nothing but an empty kitchen. The lights were visible in the pictures, but the figures he'd been watching night after night simply weren't there. This discovery sent him into what he described as a spiral of doubt and fear that lasted for several days. He questioned whether he was losing his mind, whether the isolation of ranch life had finally gotten to him, or whether he was experiencing some kind of delayed reaction to his experiences in Vietnam. But then, on October 30th, something happened that convinced my grandfather that whatever he'd been seeing was real, even if the camera couldn't capture it. He wrote that he'd been awakened at around 3 in the morning by the sound of knocking at his front door. When he looked outside, he saw the same 2 figures from the Kowalski house standing on his porch. They looked exactly as they had in the abandoned kitchen, complete with the blurred features and completely black eyes. But now they were at his door, apparently wanting to come inside. My grandfather wrote that he stood frozen in his hallway, afraid to make any sound that might alert the figures to his presence. The knocking continued for what felt like hours, a steady, rhythmic sound that seemed to echo through the entire house. Between the knocks, my grandfather could hear what sounded like whispered conversation, but the words were in a language he didn't recognize, something that sounded like a combination of static and wind through dead trees. The journal entry from October 31st, the last one my grandfather ever wrote about the Kowalski house, describes how he spent the entire night huddled in his bedroom closet with his rifle across his knees. The knocking had stopped sometime around dawn, and when he finally worked up the courage to look outside, the figures were gone. But they'd left something behind that made my grandfather pack up his things and drive into town to stay with friends for the next 2 weeks. Someone had arranged small piles of dirt and dead insects on his front porch. Dozens of them, each one carefully placed in a perfect circle around his door. The dirt looked like it had been scraped from a grave, dark and rich and full of things that my grandfather didn't want to identify. The insects were all the same types he'd seen the figures eating in the Kowalski kitchen, beetles and moths and other creatures that looked like they'd been dead for months. The final entry in my grandfather's journal, dated November 15th, simply says, "The lights in the Kowalski house have stopped. I hope they've moved on to wherever they belong, but I have a feeling they'll be back someday, and next time they might not be content to just knock on the door." My grandfather never wrote another word about the Kowalski house, but he never went back to his ranch either. He sold the property 6 months later and moved into town, where he lived until his death 15 years ago. When I asked my grandmother about why they'd left the ranch so suddenly, she always said it was because my grandfather had gotten too old for the isolation and hard work. But after finding his journal, I realized she'd been protecting a secret that was too strange and terrifying for most people to accept. Last year, I drove out to where the old ranch used to be just to see what had become of the place. The house my grandparents lived in has been torn down, but the Kowalski place is still standing and it's still empty. The current landowner told me that he's tried to rent it out several times over the years, but tenants never stay more than a few weeks. They all complain about strange lights in the kitchen and the sound of knocking at their doors in the middle of the night. I didn't tell him what I'd read in my grandfather's journal, but I made sure to visit the property during daylight hours. Even in the bright Wyoming sunshine, the Kowalski house felt wrong somehow, like a place where something terrible had happened and never quite finished happening. I didn't stick around to see if the lights still appear at 9:15 every night, but I have a feeling that some things never really leave, They just wait patiently for the next person who's curious enough to look too closely. The strangest part of my grandfather's story isn't the supernatural elements or the unexplained phenomena. It's the fact that a man who survived combat in Vietnam and spent 40 years working a ranch in one of the most isolated parts of America could be driven from his home by something he couldn't fight or understand. Whatever those figures were, whatever they wanted, it was enough to convince a tough, practical man that some battles aren't worth fighting, and some mysteries are better left unsolved. I am going to tell you exactly what I told Sheriff Morrison that night in November 2019, word for word, because I have gone over it 1,000 times in my head. Sheriff, you asked me why I will not let my kids go to any Halloween activities. Well, let me tell you about what happened when I was 12 years old at the Brennan family corn maze. This was back in October 1995, and the Brennan farm was about 15 miles outside of our little town of Clearwater. Population 837 if you counted the Hendricks twins who lived in that trailer behind the grain elevator. The Brennans had been running their corn maze for maybe 3 years at that point, and it had become the biggest Halloween attraction for 50 miles in any direction. Kids would come from as far away as North Platte just to get lost in their maze and scared by whatever surprises they had waiting in there. Now you have to understand something about rural Nebraska in the 90s. There was not much for kids to do, especially in October when the weather started turning cold and the days got shorter. We had already been through all the good fishing spots, we had ridden our bikes down every gravel road worth exploring, and most of us were too young to be interested in the kinds of trouble that the high school kids got into. So when the Brennan corn maze opened up each year, it was like Christmas morning for every kid in 3 counties. My best friend at the time was a kid named Danny Kowalczyk, and his older brother Marcus was supposed to take us to the maze that Saturday afternoon. But Marcus came down with some kind of stomach bug, or at least that is what he told his mother. I suspect he was just hungover from whatever he and his buddies had been drinking the night before. But Mrs. Kowalczyk believed him and told Danny that we would have to wait until the following weekend to go to the maze. Well, Danny was not having any of that. He had been talking about the corn maze for weeks, and he had already bragged to half our class that he was going to be the first kid to make it through without getting scared. So he came up with what seemed like a perfectly reasonable plan at the time. We would ride our bikes out to the Brennan farm on our own, pay the $5 admission fee, go through the maze, and be back home before dark. What could possibly go wrong? I should have known something was off when we got to the farm and saw how few cars were in the parking area. Usually the place would be packed on a Saturday afternoon, especially this close to Halloween. But there were maybe 6 or 7 vehicles there, mostly pickup trucks that belonged to local families. The Brennan farmhouse looked the same as always. White clapboard siding with green shutters and a wraparound porch decorated with pumpkins and corn stalks. But something about the whole scene felt different. Quieter somehow. Mrs. Brennan was sitting at a card table near the entrance to the maze, just like she did every year. She was a pleasant woman in her 50s with graying hair and a friendly smile. The kind of person who would send you home with a plate of cookies if you helped her carry in groceries. But when we walked up to pay our admission, she looked at us with what I can only describe as concern. She asked us where our parents were, and when we told her that we had ridden our bikes out there by ourselves, she shook her head and said that maybe we should come back another day with adult supervision. Danny started to argue with her, saying that we were old enough to handle a corn maze and that we had been looking forward to this for weeks. I could see Mrs. Brennan wavering, probably remembering when she was 12 and desperate for some excitement. Finally, she sighed and took our $10, but she made us promise that we would stick together no matter what happened in the maze. She also gave us each a whistle and told us to blow them if we got separated. or if we needed help for any reason. At the time, I thought she was just being overly cautious, the way adults always seem to be when kids wanted to have any real fun. Looking back, I realized she was trying to protect us from something she knew was waiting in that maze. The entrance to the corn maze was marked by 2 tall posts with a wooden sign that read Brennan Family Corn Maze, enter at your own risk. The corn stalks on either side of the entrance were easily 8 feet tall, thick and healthy from what had been a good growing season. Once you stepped between those posts, the world outside the maze just disappeared. All you could see was corn in every direction, and all you could hear was the rustling of the stalks in the October wind. Danny immediately took charge, declaring that he had studied maps of corn mazes online and knew the secret to getting through them quickly. His strategy was to always turn right when we came to a dead end, which he claimed would eventually lead us to the center of the maze and then back out again. I had no better plan, so I followed him as we started making our way through the narrow pathways between the corn rows. The first 15 or 20 minutes were exactly what you would expect from a corn maze. We hit a few dead ends, backtracked, tried different routes, and gradually worked our way deeper into the maze. We could hear other people somewhere else in the maze, voices echoing off the corn stalks, but we never saw anyone. The pathways were wide enough for 2 people to walk side by side, and the corn was so thick that you could not see more than a few feet in any direction. That is when we started finding the scarecrows. The first one was just a traditional scarecrow, the kind you might see in any cornfield. It was made from old clothes stuffed with straw, with a burlap sack for a head and a floppy hat. But there was something about the way it was positioned that made both of us stop and stare. Instead of being mounted on a post, like a normal scarecrow, this one was sitting on a wooden chair that had been placed right in the middle of the pathway. Its head was tilted to one side like it was listening to something, and its straw-stuffed arms were positioned like it was reaching for whoever might walk by. Danny laughed and said that the Brennans were really going all out with their decorations this year. He walked right up to the scarecrow and poked it in the chest, making jokes about how realistic it looked. But I noticed that the clothes the scarecrow was wearing were not the usual old work clothes you would expect. This scarecrow was wearing a relatively new flannel shirt and blue jeans that looked like they had been worn recently. The boots on its feet were muddy, like someone had been walking around the farm in them just that morning. We took a few pictures with Danny's disposable camera and continued deeper into the maze. But the further we went, the more scarecrows we encountered, and each one was stranger than the last. The second one we found was standing at a crossroads where 4 pathways met, and it was pointing down one of the paths like it was giving directions. This one was wearing a woman's dress and had long brown hair that looked suspiciously real hanging down from under its floppy hat. The third scarecrow was the one that made me start feeling really uncomfortable. It was positioned around a corner in such a way that you would almost walk right into it before you saw it. This one was wearing a Letterman jacket from our high school, and the name stitched on the front read, Kowalczyk. Danny went pale when he saw it because his older brother Marcus had a jacket just like that one. In fact, Danny was pretty sure this was Marcus's jacket, which should have been hanging in his bedroom closet back home. We spent about 10 minutes examining that scarecrow, trying to figure out how the Brennans could have gotten hold of Marcus's jacket. The only explanation we could come up with was that Marcus had somehow loaned it to them for their Halloween display, but that did not make any sense. Marcus was proud of that jacket and protective of it. He would never let anyone else wear it, much less use it to dress up a scarecrow. Danny tried to pull the jacket off the scarecrow to get a better look at it, but it seemed to be attached somehow. The more he tugged at it, the more agitated he became, and finally he started yelling at the scarecrow, demanding to know how it had gotten his brother's jacket. That is when I noticed that the scarecrow's head had shifted slightly, like it was turning to look at Danny while he yelled. I told Danny that we should leave the jacket alone and keep moving through the maze, but he was fixated on it. He was convinced that someone had stolen the jacket from his house and was using it to mess with us. He started talking about how we should find whoever was in charge of the maze and demand an explanation. But when he tried to use the whistle that Mrs. Brennan had given us, it would not make any sound. He blew as hard as he could, but nothing came out. That is when we heard the laughter. It was coming from somewhere deeper in the maze, a low chuckling sound that seemed to echo off the cornstalks from multiple directions at once. It did not sound like the kind of laughter you would hear from other visitors having fun in the maze. This was darker, more menacing, like someone was laughing at a joke that we were not in on. Danny and I looked at each other, and I could see that he was starting to get scared too. We decided to abandon his right turn strategy and just focus on finding our way out of the maze as quickly as possible. But no matter which direction we went, we seemed to keep running into more scarecrows. They were everywhere now, positioned at every turn and crossroads. Some were sitting, some were standing, and some were posed in ways that made them look like they were dancing or playing games with each other. The worst part was that they were all wearing clothes that looked familiar. One was wearing a dress that I was pretty sure belonged to my third-grade teacher, Mrs. Patterson. Another was wearing a sheriff's uniform that looked exactly like the one Sheriff Morrison wore, complete with the badge and nameplate. There was even one wearing the same type of overalls that my grandfather always wore when he worked in his garden. As we got deeper into the maze, the scarecrows started looking more and more realistic. Their faces, which had been simple burlap sacks with painted features near the entrance, were now much more detailed. Some had faces that looked almost human, with realistic eyes and mouths that seemed to be smiling or frowning. One scarecrow that we passed had eyes that I swear followed us as we walked by. Danny was getting increasingly frantic, turning down pathways at random and sometimes doubling back when he realized we had been down the same route before. The sun was starting to get lower in the sky, and the shadows between the cornstalks were getting longer and darker. We had been in the maze for over an hour, and we were no closer to finding the exit than when we had started. That is when we found the scarecrow that was wearing Danny's clothes. It was sitting on a wooden stump in a small clearing, wearing the exact same red t-shirt and blue jeans that Danny had on. The same sneakers, the same baseball cap, even the same digital watch that his parents had given him for his birthday. But the most disturbing thing was the face. Instead of a burlap sack, this scarecrow had a face that looked exactly like Danny's, down to the freckles on his nose and the small scar on his chin from when he had fallen off his bike the previous summer. Danny started screaming when he saw it, not yelling or shouting, but actual screaming, the kind of sound you make when you are absolutely terrified and your mind cannot process what you are seeing. He grabbed my arm and started pulling me away from the scarecrow. But no matter which direction we went, we kept ending up back in the same clearing with the same scarecrow wearing his face. That is when I realized that we were not alone in the clearing. There were other people there, standing motionless between the cornstalks like they were part of the maze decorations. At first I thought they were just more scarecrows, but then I noticed that they were breathing. They were real people, but they were standing perfectly still with their arms at their sides and their eyes staring straight ahead. I recognized some of them. There was Tommy Richardson, who had graduated from our high school 3 years earlier and then disappeared one day without telling anyone where he was going. There was Mrs. Henderson, who used to run the post office before she had stopped showing up to work the previous spring. There was even Marcus Kowalczyk, Danny's older brother, wearing the same clothes he had been wearing when he said he was too sick to take us to the maze. They were all just standing there, not moving, not talking, not even blinking. But they were alive. I could see their chests rising and falling as they breathed, and occasionally one of them would twitch slightly, like they were trying to move but could not quite manage it. Danny was calling his brother's name, begging him to respond, but Marcus just stood there staring at nothing. That is when the man appeared. He stepped out from between the cornstalks like he had been waiting there for us to find him. He was tall and thin, wearing dark clothes that seemed to blend with the shadows between the corn rows. His face was pale and gaunt, with deep-set eyes that seemed to reflect light like an animal's. But the most disturbing thing about him was his smile. He had the kind of smile that you might see on someone who had just heard the funniest joke in the world. Except there was nothing funny about our situation. He told us that we were the guests of honor at his harvest festival, and that we should feel privileged to be chosen for such a special role. He explained that every year he selected a few special visitors to join his collection, people who would help him tend to his maze and make it more interesting for future guests. The scarecrows, he said, were just the beginning. The real magic happened when he found people who were willing to become permanent residents of his maze. Danny asked him what he had done to his brother, and the man laughed, that same chuckling sound we had heard earlier. He said that Marcus was perfectly safe and that he was simply learning to appreciate the simple pleasures of country life. All of his new residents, he explained, discovered that there was great peace to be found in standing still and letting the world move around them. They no longer had to worry about jobs or relationships or any of the complicated problems of modern life. I grabbed Danny's hand and we ran. We did not have any plan or strategy, we just ran as fast as we could through the corn maze, taking turns at random and hoping that we would somehow find our way out. Behind us, we could hear the man laughing and calling after us, telling us that we could not leave the maze until he gave us permission. He said that the maze would keep us there as long as he wanted, and that eventually we would get tired and have to stop running. But we did not stop. We ran until our lungs burned and our legs felt like they were going to collapse. And somehow, miraculously, we found ourselves back at the entrance where Mrs. Brennan was still sitting at her card table. She looked up at us with a sad expression, like she had been expecting us to come running out of the maze in exactly this condition. She did not ask us what had happened or why we looked so terrified. She just told us to get on our bikes and ride straight home and to never come back to the maze again. She also made us promise that we would not tell anyone what we had seen in there because no one would believe us and it would only cause trouble for everyone involved. We rode our bikes home as fast as we could, and I have never ridden past the Brennan farm since then. Danny and I never talked about what happened that day, not even to each other. When people asked us how the corn maze was, we just said it was fine and changed the subject. When Danny's parents asked him where Marcus was, he told them that Marcus had said he was going to spend the night at a friend's house. Marcus never came home. His parents filed a missing person report and the sheriff organized search parties, but they never found any trace of him. The official explanation was that he had run away from home, maybe to join the military or find work in a bigger city. His parents eventually stopped talking about him, and after a few years, it was like he had never existed at all. The Brennan family stopped running their corn maze after that year. Mrs. Brennan told people that they were getting too old to maintain it properly, and that the insurance costs were getting too high. The cornfield where the maze used to be was planted with soybeans the following spring, and it has been soybeans ever since. But sometimes when I drive past the Brennan farm on my way to the grain elevator, I can see people standing in that soybean field. They are too far away for me to recognize their faces, but they are just standing there motionless, like they are waiting for something. And sometimes when the wind is blowing just right, I can hear that same chuckling laughter that we heard in the maze. That is why I will not let my kids go to Halloween activities, Sheriff Morrison. Because I know that there are things out there that use our celebrations and traditions as hunting grounds. They use our desire for fun and excitement to lure us into situations where we become vulnerable. and once they have you, they do not let you go. Danny Kowalczyk moved away from Clearwater the day after he graduated from high school. He left town without saying goodbye to anyone, including me, and I have not heard from him since. But I understand why he had to leave. Some experiences change you in ways that make it impossible to stay in the place where they happened. I stayed in Clearwater because this is my home, and because I feel like I have a responsibility to make sure that what happened to us does not happen to other kids. Every Halloween, I make sure to drive past every farm and rural attraction in the county just to see if there are any new corn mazes or haunted attractions that might be more than they appear to be. So far, everything has been normal. Just regular families trying to make a little extra money during the Halloween season, with regular decorations and regular scares. But I keep watching, because I know that someday something like the Brennan Maze might appear again. And when it does, I want to be ready to warn people before they make the same mistake that Danny and I made that October afternoon in 1995. That is my statement, Sheriff Morrison. I know it sounds crazy, and I know you probably think I am making it all up or that I misremembered what happened when I was a kid. But I am telling you the absolute truth, and I will swear to it on a stack of Bibles if you want me to. There are things in this world that use our own celebrations against us, and we ignore them at our own peril. Being a mail carrier in rural Kentucky means you see things that aren't meant to be seen. Most days it's just elderly folks excited for their Social Security checks. But Route 47 had one address that made my skin crawl every time I had to drive down that gravel road. The mailbox said Hendricks, but I'm pretty sure whatever lived in that house wasn't human. I started working for the Postal Service in 2019, fresh out of college with a degree I couldn't use and student loans I couldn't ignore. The job wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills and got me out of the apartment I was sharing with two roommates who thought hygiene was optional. Rural mail delivery seemed like it would be peaceful, maybe even therapeutic, driving through the beautiful Kentucky countryside, delivering letters and packages to people who were genuinely happy to see you. My route covered about 60 square miles of some of the most isolated farmland and forested hills in eastern Kentucky. The kind of place where your GPS gives up and you have to rely on handwritten directions from the postmaster. Most of my stops were at the end of long dirt driveways, serving families who had been living on the same land for generations. They were good people, the kind who would invite you in for sweet tea and ask about your family like they had known you all your life. But the Hendricks place was different from the very first day I had to deliver mail there. The mailbox sat at the end of a gravel road that curved up into the hills, disappearing behind a thick stand of pine trees that blocked any view of the house from the main road. The mailbox itself was newer than most of the others on my route, painted bright red with Hendricks stenciled in black letters across the side. But there was something about it that felt wrong, like someone had tried too hard to make it look normal. The first time I drove up that gravel road to deliver a package that wouldn't fit in the mailbox, I got about halfway to the house before I started feeling sick to my stomach. It wasn't motion sickness from the winding road or anything like that. It was a deep, primitive kind of fear that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up and my hands shake on the steering wheel. Every instinct I had was telling me to turn around and get away from that place as fast as possible. But I needed the job, and leaving mail undelivered was a good way to lose it. So I kept driving up that gravel road even though my heart was pounding and I was starting to sweat despite the cool October weather. The trees on either side of the road were dense and dark, creating a tunnel effect that made it feel like I was driving deeper underground instead of up into the hills. When I finally reached the clearing where the house sat, what I saw made me question whether I was losing my mind. The house itself looked normal enough, a single-story ranch-style building with vinyl siding and a metal roof. but there were things scattered around the yard that didn't belong in any normal residential setting. There were dozens of metal stakes driven into the ground in perfect geometric patterns, each one about 3 feet tall with something tied to the top that looked like strips of fabric or paper fluttering in the wind. The front yard was divided into sections by what looked like surveyor's tape stretched between wooden posts, creating a grid pattern that extended from the house to the edge of the tree line. Each section contained something different. One had what appeared to be animal bones arranged in circles. Another had pieces of broken mirror stuck into the ground at regular intervals, reflecting the sunlight in harsh, painful flashes. A third section was completely bare except for dark stains in the soil that looked suspiciously like dried blood. I sat in my mail truck for several minutes trying to decide whether I should deliver the package or just mark it as undeliverable and drive away. That's when I noticed that someone was watching me from the house. There was a figure standing at one of the windows, perfectly still, and even from 50 feet away I could tell that whoever it was wasn't moving at all, not even to breathe. They just stood there staring at my truck with an intensity that made my skin crawl. I decided to compromise. I would walk to the front door, leave the package, and get out of there as quickly as possible. But as I walked across that bizarre front yard, stepping carefully around the stakes and tape and mirror fragments, I started noticing details that made the whole situation even more disturbing. The strips of fabric tied to the stakes weren't fabric at all. They were pieces of clothing, children's clothing, faded and weathered like they had been hanging there for years. The bones in the circles weren't from the kinds of animals you would expect to find on a rural Kentucky farm. Some of them were too small to be from cattle or pigs, but too large to be from chickens or rabbits. And they were arranged in patterns that seemed deliberate, almost ritualistic, like someone had been using them for some kind of ceremony or sacrifice. When I got to the front door, I could hear sounds coming from inside the house that didn't make any sense. There was a rhythmic tapping like someone hammering nails, but it was too fast and too regular to be any kind of normal construction work. Underneath that was a low humming sound, like machinery running. But it had an organic quality that made me think of insects or maybe even human voices. I left the package by the door and walked back to my truck as quickly as I could without running. The figure in the window never moved, never acknowledged my presence, just continued staring with that unblinking intensity. As I drove back down the gravel road, I checked my rearview mirror and saw that the figure had moved to a different window, one that gave them a better view of the road. They were still there, still staring, when I reached the main road and they disappeared behind the trees. That night I called my supervisor and asked if there was anything unusual about the Hendricks address that I should know about. He said he'd never heard anything strange about them, but the previous mail carrier on that route had requested a transfer after only 6 months. When I asked why, he said the guy claimed he was having nightmares about one of the houses on his route, but he never said which one or what the dreams were about. The next delivery to the Hendricks place came 2 weeks later. This time it was just regular mail, so I could leave it in the mailbox without having to drive up to the house. But when I opened the mailbox to put the letters inside, I found something that made me immediately slam it shut and step back. There were dozens of photographs stuffed into the mailbox, all of them showing the same thing. Me. Walking across their front yard, leaving the package, getting back into my truck. Someone had been watching me from multiple locations and taking pictures the entire time I was on their property. The photographs were taken from different angles and distances, suggesting that there had been more than one person watching me, or that someone had moved very quickly between different vantage points while I was delivering the package. Some of the photos were taken from ground level, as if someone had been hiding in the tall grass or behind the trees. Others were taken from above, like someone had been in the trees or on the roof of the house. I should have reported it to the police right then, but I was young and stupid and convinced myself that there had to be some innocent explanation. Maybe they were having problems with theft or vandalism and were documenting everyone who came onto their property. Maybe they were just paranoid about strangers and wanted to keep records for their own protection. I took the photographs with me and threw them away, hoping that would be the end of it. But it wasn't the end. Every time I had to deliver mail to the Hendricks place after that, there were more photographs in the mailbox. Pictures of me driving up their road, pictures of me walking to their door, pictures of me back at the post office sorting mail, pictures of me at home in my apartment. Someone was following me, documenting my daily routine and using the mail delivery as a way to let me know that they were watching. The photographs got progressively more disturbing. Some showed me sleeping in my bedroom, taken from outside my window. Others showed me grocery shopping, getting gas, visiting friends. There were even pictures of me at places I didn't remember going or doing things I didn't remember doing, like I was being watched constantly and had become so accustomed to the surveillance that I wasn't even aware of it anymore. The worst ones were the pictures that seemed to have been taken from impossible angles or distances. Photos of me from directly overhead, as if someone had been floating in the air above me. Pictures that showed perfect detail of my face and expressions from hundreds of yards away, far beyond what any normal camera lens could accomplish. And there were pictures that showed me in places I had never been, doing things I had never done. But that looked absolutely real and convincing. I finally worked up the courage to drive back up to the Hendricks house and confront whoever was living there. This was a mistake that I still regret making, but at the time I was angry and scared and convinced that a direct confrontation was the only way to make the harassment stop. I drove up that gravel road on a Saturday afternoon when I wouldn't be in my official mail truck and wouldn't be violating any postal service policies. When I got to the clearing where the house sat, I could see immediately that things had changed since my last delivery. The stakes in the yard had been rearranged into different patterns, and there were new additions that made the whole scene even more disturbing. There were mannequins scattered around the property, dressed in mail carrier uniforms that looked exactly like the one I wore to work. Some of the mannequins were positioned like they were walking toward the house. Others were face down in the dirt like they had fallen or been knocked over. One mannequin was hanging from a tree branch by a rope around its neck, spinning slowly in the breeze. It was wearing a name tag that said Delilah in the same font and style as the official Postal Service name tags. When I got closer, I could see that it wasn't just wearing a mail carrier uniform. It was wearing clothes that I recognized as identical to ones in my own closet, down to the specific brand of shoes and the style of watch I wore to work. I walked up to the front door and knocked, ready to demand answers about the photographs and the surveillance and the creepy mannequins. But when the door opened, the person standing there wasn't what I had been expecting. It was a woman in her 50s, pleasant-looking, wearing a floral dress and an apron like she had been cooking dinner. She looked completely normal, like someone's grandmother, not at all like the kind of person who would engage in stalking and harassment. She smiled at me and said that she had been wondering when I would finally come to visit. She invited me in for coffee and said she had something special to show me that she thought I would find very interesting. Against every instinct I had, I followed her into the house, partly because she seemed so normal and harmless, and partly because I was curious about what kind of person could live in a place surrounded by such disturbing displays. The inside of the house was even more disturbing than the outside. Every wall was covered with photographs, hundreds of them, all showing the same person. Me. Pictures of me from infancy to the present day, including photos that I knew for certain had never been taken. Baby pictures that my own mother didn't have. School photos from years when I had been homeschooled. Vacation pictures from trips I had never taken to places I had never been. The woman, who introduced herself as Mrs. Hendricks, explained that she had been documenting my entire life as part of a project she was working on. She said that I had been chosen for this project when I was very young, and that everything I had ever done, every place I had ever been, every person I had ever met, had been carefully planned and arranged to serve the purposes of her research. She showed me filing cabinets full of documents related to my life, report cards from schools I didn't remember attending, medical records from doctors I had never seen, employment records from jobs I had never had. There were detailed charts tracking my daily routines, my relationships, my preferences and habits. There were psychological profiles and behavioral analyses that went back decades, written in the kind of clinical language you would expect to find in a research facility or government laboratory. Mrs. Hendricks explained that I wasn't the first mail carrier to be selected for the project. There had been others before me, and there would be others after me when my part in the research was complete. She showed me photographs of previous mail carriers, all of them young women who looked similar to me, all of them documented in the same obsessive detail throughout their entire lives. When I asked what happened to the previous subjects when their participation in the project was finished, Mrs. Hendricks smiled that same pleasant grandmother smile and said that they had moved on to the next phase of the research. She led me to a back room that I immediately wished I had never seen. There were mannequins there too, but these ones weren't wearing uniforms. They were wearing the skin and hair of real people, preserved in some way that made them look almost alive but not quite right. I ran. I didn't ask any more questions or try to get any more answers. I just ran out of that house and down that gravel road faster than I had ever run in my life. I got in my car and drove straight to the police station, where I tried to explain what I had seen and experienced. But when the officers went to investigate the Hendricks property, they found it completely empty. No house, no mannequins, no strange displays in the yard. Just an empty lot with no signs that anyone had ever lived there. The official explanation was that I had been under stress from my job and had experienced some kind of breakdown or hallucination. The Postal Service transferred me to a different route, and I never had to drive down that gravel road again. But I kept all of the photographs that had been left in the mailbox, and they're all still there, clear evidence that something really happened. I quit the Postal Service 6 months later and moved to a different state. I work in an office now, a nice, safe job where I never have to make deliveries to isolated houses or deal with people who might not be entirely human. But sometimes when I'm checking my mail at my apartment complex, I find photographs that I know I didn't take, showing me in places I don't remember being, doing things I don't remember doing. And sometimes late at night I can hear the sound of gravel crunching outside my window, like someone is walking up a long driveway that doesn't exist, coming to make a delivery that I don't want to receive. The rural countryside might look peaceful and innocent, but there are things living out there in the isolated places that use our routines and our jobs as ways to get close to us, to study us, to add us to their collections. I never found out what Mrs. Hendricks was really researching or why she had chosen me for her project. But I know that there are others out there, other people whose entire lives have been documented and manipulated by forces they don't understand for purposes they can't imagine. The next time you see your mail carrier walking up your driveway, remember that they might be carrying more than just letters and packages. They might be carrying the documentation of your entire existence, compiled by someone who has been watching you far longer than you could ever imagine. I moved to Louisiana in 2020 to study alligator migration patterns for my master's thesis. Local fishermen warned me about night research, said some waters aren't meant to be disturbed after dark. I thought they were just being superstitious until I set up my equipment near Dead Man's Cove and discovered what the gators were really feeding on. When I first arrived in St. Bernard Parish, about 40 miles southeast of New Orleans, I was excited to finally be conducting field research instead of just reading about it in academic journals. My advisor at Tulane had connected me with the Louisiana Department of Wildlife and Fisheries, and they had given me permission to tag and track alligators in some of the more remote waterways that most researchers avoided because of access issues. The local wildlife office was run by a man named Claude Boudreau, who had been working in the Louisiana wetlands for over 30 years. He was the kind of person who could tell you everything about the ecosystem just by looking at the watercolor and smelling the air. When I explained my research project to him, he was enthusiastic and helpful, offering me the use of a small airboat and giving me detailed maps of the waterways where I was most likely to find the kind of alligator populations I needed for my study. But when I mentioned that I would need to do most of my work at night, since that's when alligators are most active, Claude's demeanor changed completely. He started asking me a lot of questions about exactly where I planned to set up my equipment and whether I had considered doing the research during daylight hours instead. When I insisted that nighttime research was essential for accurate data collection, he reluctantly agreed to help me but made me promise that I would stay in radio contact with his office and that I would never work alone. The area where I was planning to conduct my research was a network of interconnected bayous and marshlands that had been largely untouched by commercial development. It was exactly the kind of pristine habitat that I needed for my study. But it was also incredibly isolated. The nearest road was over 5 miles away, and the only way to reach the research sites was by boat through narrow channels that wound through dense cypress swamps and salt marshes. For the first few weeks, everything went according to plan. I would arrive at my research sites in the late afternoon, set up my equipment before dark, and then spend the night collecting data on alligator behavior and movement patterns. The work was challenging and sometimes uncomfortable, but I was getting excellent data and making good progress toward completing my thesis. The problem started when I decided to expand my research area to include a section of waterway called Dead Man's Cove. According to my maps, this area had the highest concentration of large adult alligators in the entire parish, which made it perfect for my research. But when I mentioned to Claude that I wanted to work in Dead Man's Cove, he immediately tried to talk me out of it. He told me that area had a bad reputation among local fishermen and hunters, and that people who worked there at night sometimes reported seeing and hearing things that couldn't be explained. When I pressed him for more specific information, he said that several people had disappeared in that area over the years and that search teams had never been able to find any trace of them. He suggested that I stick to the research sites that I had already been using, where the alligator populations were almost as dense, but the area was considered safer. But I was a scientist, not a superstitious local fisherman, and I wasn't going to let folklore and ghost stories interfere with my research. Dead Man's Cove represented the best opportunity I had to collect data on large adult alligators, and I wasn't going to pass it up because of some vague warnings about bad things happening at night. So on a humid Tuesday evening in late August, I loaded my equipment into the airboat and headed out to Dead Man's Cove to set up my first night of research in the new location. The area was even more remote and isolated than my previous research sites, accessible only through a narrow channel that wound through miles of cypress swamp before opening up into a large, dark pool of water surrounded by dense marsh grass. The first thing I noticed about Dead Man's Cove was the smell. All of the bayou areas had their own distinctive odors, usually a combination of decaying vegetation, stagnant water, and whatever marine life happened to be in the area. But Dead Man's Cove smelled different, like something large had died in the water and been left to rot. The smell was so strong that I had to breathe through my mouth to keep from gagging. The second thing I noticed was the unusual behavior of the wildlife in the area. In my previous research sites, I would usually see and hear a variety of birds, frogs, insects, and other creatures going about their normal nighttime activities. But Dead Man's Cove was eerily quiet. There were no bird calls, no frog croaking, no insect buzzing. The only sounds were the gentle lapping of water against the sides of my boat and the distant splash of what I assumed were alligators moving through the water. I set up my equipment just as the sun was setting, positioning my cameras and sensors at strategic locations around the cove to capture as much alligator activity as possible. According to my preliminary surveys, there should have been at least a dozen large adult alligators in this area, but as the evening progressed, I wasn't seeing nearly as much activity as I had expected. It wasn't until around midnight that I started to realize why the local fishermen had warned me about this place. I was sitting in my boat, monitoring my equipment and taking notes, when I heard what sounded like human voices coming from somewhere across the cove. At first, I thought it might be other researchers or maybe fishermen who were working in the area. But as I listened more carefully, I realized that the voices didn't sound quite right. They were speaking in what might have been English, but the words were distorted and unclear, like someone was trying to talk with their mouth full of water. And there were too many voices, at least a dozen different people all talking at once, but I couldn't see any boats or lights that would indicate the presence of other people in the area. I turned on my high-powered flashlight and swept it across the water in the direction of the voices. But all I could see were the glowing red eyes of alligators reflecting back at me. There were a lot of them, more than I had ever seen in one location, and they were all facing in my direction like they were watching me. That's when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The alligators weren't just floating in the water like they normally do. They were arranged in a perfect circle around something in the center of the cove, and they were all completely motionless. It looked like they were guarding whatever was in the middle of their formation. I used my telephoto camera lens to get a better look at what the alligators were surrounding, and what I saw made me question my own sanity. There were people in the water, at least a dozen of them, standing waist-deep in the dark water in the center of the alligator circle. They were all facing outward toward the alligators, and their mouths were moving like they were speaking, but I was too far away to hear what they were saying. The strangest part was that the people in the water didn't seem to be afraid of the alligators, and the alligators didn't seem to be threatening the people. They were just arranged in this bizarre formation, like they were participating in some kind of ceremony or ritual that I couldn't understand. I tried to get closer to see what was happening, but as soon as I started my boat engine, the entire scene just disappeared. The people in the water sank beneath the surface without making any splash or disturbance, and the alligators scattered in all directions. Within seconds, the cove looked completely normal again. Just dark water and marsh grass, with no sign that anything unusual had been happening. I spent the rest of that night trying to convince myself that I had been hallucinating or that my eyes had been playing tricks on me in the darkness. But when I reviewed the footage from my cameras the next morning, I could clearly see the people standing in the water, surrounded by the circle of alligators. The audio recordings had captured their voices, speaking in that strange, distorted language that didn't quite sound human. Over the next few weeks, I returned to Dead Man's Cove several more times to continue my research, and each time I witnessed similar scenes. Groups of people would appear in the water around midnight, always surrounded by alligators, always speaking in that disturbing waterlogged language. Sometimes there would be more people, sometimes fewer, but they were always there, and they always disappeared as soon as I tried to get closer. I started to recognize some of the faces in the water. One of them looked like a fisherman named Eddie Thibodeau, who had disappeared from the area 3 years earlier. Another looked like a woman named Marie Boudreau, Claude's cousin, who had gone missing while collecting samples for the university environmental lab. A third looked like a teenage boy who had been reported missing from a nearby town the previous summer. The most disturbing realization was that the people in the water all looked exactly the same as they had when they disappeared. They hadn't aged or decomposed or changed in any way. They just stood there in the dark water, speaking their incomprehensible language, while the alligators formed protective circles around them. I tried to research the history of Dead Man's Cove to see if I could find any explanation for what I was witnessing. What I discovered was that people had been disappearing in that area for over a century. Native American tribes had considered the area to be cursed or haunted, and early French settlers had reported similar disappearances. Local records showed that dozens of people had vanished in Dead Man's Cove over the years, and none of them had ever been found. The more I learned about the history of the area, the more I realized that I was witnessing something that had been happening for generations. The people who disappeared in Dead Man's Cove didn't die in the conventional sense. They became part of something else. Something that existed in the dark water and communicated in a language that human ears weren't meant to understand. I completed my thesis research using data from other locations, and I never returned to Dead Man's Cove. But I still have the video footage and audio recordings from my nights there, and sometimes I review them trying to understand what I witnessed. The voices in the recordings have a hypnotic quality that makes me want to go back to the water, to join the circle of people standing in the darkness, to learn their language and become part of whatever ancient ceremony they're conducting. The local fishermen were right to warn me about disturbing those waters at night. Some places are meant to be left alone, and some research is too dangerous to conduct. The alligators in Dead Man's Cove aren't just predators feeding on fish and small mammals. They're guardians of something much older and more mysterious, something that collects people who venture too close to the truth and transforms them into permanent residents of the dark water. My advice to anyone conducting research in remote areas is to listen to the warnings of local people, even if their concerns seem superstitious or unscientific. Sometimes folklore and legend are the only ways that communities can pass down knowledge about dangers that science isn't equipped to understand or explain. And sometimes the most important discovery you can make is knowing when to stop looking and walk away. My grandmother used to say that every small town has one secret that everybody knows, but nobody talks about. I thought she was just being dramatic until the summer of 2018 when I moved back to help with her medical bills. That's when I learned what really happened at the monthly potluck dinners at Cornerstone Baptist Church, and why certain families never attended. I had been living in Austin for about 8 years, working as a mechanic at one of those quick change oil places. When my grandmother called me in June of 2018 and told me that her diabetes was getting worse and she needed help managing her medications, I knew I had to come back. She had raised me after my parents died in a car accident when I was 7. So I packed up my belongings and drove back to Cedar Ridge, Texas, population 412. My grandmother lived in the same house where I had spent my teenage years, with a backyard that backed up to the cemetery behind the Baptist church. Within the first week, I realized that my grandmother's health problems were more serious than she had let on. But as she got better with my help, she started talking about the church potlucks. Cornerstone Baptist Church held a community potluck dinner on the first Sunday of every month. My grandmother had been attending these for over 30 years, but something had changed in recent years. She would say that the food tasted strange, or that people were acting differently, or that there were families attending who she didn't recognize. I offered to go with her to the next potluck to see what she was worried about. The potluck was scheduled for the first Sunday in July, and my grandmother spent the entire week preparing her famous cornbread dressing. The fellowship hall was crowded when we arrived, easily 60 people in a town of 400. My grandmother introduced me to several people that I remembered from my childhood, but there were also a lot of faces that I didn't recognize. When we sat down to eat, I immediately understood what my grandmother had been trying to tell me. My first bite of what was supposed to be macaroni and cheese had a flavor that I couldn't identify, something earthy and bitter. The green bean casserole had the same off taste, and the potato salad made my mouth feel numb. I looked around to see if other people were having the same reaction, but everyone else seemed to be eating normally and enjoying their meals. Even my grandmother was eating steadily, though I could see concentration on her face. That's when I noticed the families that weren't there. Growing up in Cedar Ridge, I had known most of the regular church families, but several of these families were missing. The Hendersons, the Rodriguezes, the Washingtons, the Kowalskis. When I asked my grandmother about this, she told me that these families had stopped coming to the potlucks about 2 years earlier. They still attended regular church services, but they always made excuses to leave before the monthly potluck dinners. I decided to introduce myself to some of the families that I didn't recognize. The first family I approached looked at each other with expressions that seemed almost panicked when I told them my name. They claimed to have been attending the church for years, but when I asked them where they lived or what brought them to Cedar Ridge, they gave vague answers that didn't make sense. The same thing happened with the next few families. They all claimed to be regular members, but none could give specific details about their lives in Cedar Ridge. When I asked one woman where her children went to school, she said they were homeschooled. When I asked a man what he did for work, he said he was retired. I started to feel like I was in some surreal dream where everyone was playing a role, but nobody could remember their lines. These people looked normal and acted friendly, but there was something hollow about their responses. On the drive home, my grandmother told me that she had been wondering about the same thing for months. More and more unfamiliar families had been showing up at the potlucks, but when she tried to get to know them better, they would always change the subject. She also told me something that made my blood run cold. She had started keeping track of the families who attended the potlucks, and she had noticed a pattern. Every few months, one of the regular Cedar Ridge families would stop coming to the potlucks, and shortly afterward, a new, unfamiliar family would start attending. Over the next few weeks, I started investigating. I went to the library and looked through old church directories and newspaper archives. What I found was disturbing. According to the records I could find, several of the families that claimed to be longtime members had never existed in Cedar Ridge. There were no birth certificates, marriage licenses, property deeds, or any other official documents proving they had ever lived in the area. I also discovered something else frightening. When I looked through old newspaper obituaries, I found records for several Cedar Ridge families who had supposedly died in accidents over the past few years. But these were the same families that my grandmother said had simply stopped attending the potlucks. The Martinez family had reportedly died in a house fire 2 years earlier. But according to my grandmother, they hadn't died. They had just stopped coming to the potlucks. The Johnson family had supposedly died in a car accident, but my grandmother remembered them being alive and well. The more I researched, the more I realized there was a systematic cover-up happening. Families were disappearing, official records were being falsified to make it look like they had died, and new families were taking their places at the church potlucks. I confronted my grandmother with what I had discovered, and she broke down and told me the rest. She said that the food at the potlucks definitely contained something that affected people's memories and decision-making abilities. She had been forcing herself to eat as little as possible to try to dilute whatever drugs were being used. The most terrifying part was what she had discovered about Pastor Williams, the minister, who had been leading Cornerstone Baptist Church for the past 3 years. He had arrived shortly before the disappearances started. She had researched him and discovered that he had been the minister at churches in several other small towns, and in each case, there had been unexplained disappearances during his tenure. My grandmother believed that Pastor Williams was part of some organized group that targeted small, isolated communities where people could disappear without attracting outside attention. They would replace the missing families with their own people, gradually taking over the community from within. I wanted to go to the police, but my grandmother begged me not to. She pointed out that the local sheriff was a regular attendee at the church potlucks and was likely either part of the conspiracy or under the influence of whatever drugs were being used. Instead, we decided to leave Cedar Ridge as quietly as possible. I told my grandmother to pack only her most essential belongings, and we drove to Austin that same night without telling anyone we were leaving. My grandmother lived with me in Austin for the next 2 years until she passed away from complications related to her diabetes. She would have nightmares about church potlucks and wake up convinced that someone was trying to poison her food. After she died, I tried to find out what had happened to Cedar Ridge, but according to online records, the town no longer exists. The post office was closed, the school district was dissolved, and all the residents supposedly moved away to other communities. But I know that's not what really happened. I think Pastor Williams and his people finally completed their takeover of the town, and they erased it from official records to cover up their crimes. The real residents of Cedar Ridge are probably dead, and the people who replaced them have moved on to their next target. I still have nightmares about that last potluck dinner, and I can still taste that bitter, earthy flavor that was in all the food. Sometimes I wonder if my grandmother and I would have been the next ones to disappear if we had stayed any longer. The scariest part is realizing how easy it would be for this kind of thing to happen without anyone noticing. Small rural communities are isolated and self-contained, and people are used to families moving away for economic reasons. If the disappearances are gradual and the cover-up is thorough, who would ever investigate? My advice to anyone living in a small town is to pay attention to the people around you. If families start disappearing and being replaced by strangers who can't give you straight answers about their backgrounds, don't assume it's just a coincidence. And whatever you do, don't eat anything at church potluck dinners unless you're absolutely certain you know who prepared it. I was covering a 4th grade class in October 2021 when I found a student essay that made my blood run cold. The assignment was write about your family's traditions, and little Emma Richardson had written about helping her dad with the special harvest every fall. What she described wasn't corn or apples. I had been working as a substitute teacher in Millbrook, Oregon for about 6 months when this happened. Millbrook was one of those small farming communities where everybody knew everybody, and outsiders were treated with polite suspicion until they proved themselves worthy of trust. The kind of place where the biggest excitement was usually the annual harvest festival in late October, where local farmers would display their best produce and families would compete in pie baking contests. The regular 4th grade teacher, Mrs. Patterson, had called in sick with what she said was a stomach bug, so I was covering her class for what I expected would be a routine day of math worksheets and reading comprehension exercises. But Mrs. Patterson had left instructions for the students to work on their family traditions essay, which was supposed to be part of a larger unit on community and heritage. Most of the essays were exactly what you would expect from 9- and 10-year-olds writing about their families. Tommy wrote about how his grandmother taught him to make apple butter every fall. Sarah described her family's tradition of camping at the coast every summer. Michael wrote about helping his father repair tractors and other farm equipment during the winter months when there was less field work to do. But Emma Richardson's essay was different. It was longer and more detailed than the others, written in the careful handwriting of a child who was trying very hard to get every word exactly right. And what she described made my hands shake as I read it. Emma wrote about how every October, when the regular harvest was finished and most of the other farming families were preparing for winter, her father would take her and her older brother out to what she called the back fields to help with a different kind of harvest. She described how they would work at night, using flashlights and lanterns because this special harvest could only be done in darkness. According to Emma, the back fields didn't grow the same crops as the rest of their farm. Instead of corn or wheat or vegetables, these fields grew what she called the tall ones and the quiet ones. She wrote that the tall ones looked like people but were much taller than any person she had ever seen, and they stood perfectly still in neat rows like regular crops. The quiet ones were smaller, about the size of children, and they were always sleeping with their eyes closed. Emma's essay explained that the special harvest involved carefully digging up the tall ones and the quiet ones and loading them onto trucks to be taken to what she called the delivery place. She wrote that her job was to help clean the dirt off of them and to make sure that none of them were damaged during the harvesting process. Her older brother's job was to help their father carry the heavier ones to the trucks. The most disturbing part of Emma's essay was her description of what happened to the tall ones and quiet ones after they were harvested. She wrote that some of them would be kept in the barn over the winter, where they would slowly wake up and start moving around. Others would be taken immediately to customers who lived in other towns and had placed special orders for specific types. Emma seemed to think that this was a completely normal family business, like raising cattle or growing vegetables for market. She wrote about how proud she was to be old enough to help with the special harvest, and how her father had told her that someday she would inherit the back fields and continue the family tradition. But the details in her essay made it clear that whatever the Richardsons were harvesting in their back fields, it wasn't anything that should be growing in the soil of rural Oregon. Emma described how the tall ones and quiet ones had to be handled very carefully because they would sometimes move or make sounds when they were being dug up, even though they were supposed to be sleeping. She wrote about how her father always carried a special tool that he would use to make sure they stayed quiet during the harvesting process. Most disturbing of all, Emma wrote about how the quiet ones looked just like the children from her school, and how she sometimes recognized faces of kids who had moved away from Millbrook in previous years. She seemed to think this was just a coincidence, and she wrote about how excited she would get when she found one that looked like someone she knew. After I finished reading Emma's essay, I sat at Mrs. Patterson's desk for several minutes trying to decide what to do. Part of me wanted to believe that Emma had just written a creative fiction story instead of following the assignment instructions. Maybe she had been reading too many scary books or watching too many horror movies and her imagination had gotten carried away. But there was something about the matter-of-fact way that Emma had written about these disturbing events that convinced me she was describing something she had actually experienced. The details were too specific and too consistent for a child to have made up, and there was no sense in her writing that she understood there was anything unusual or frightening about what she was describing. I decided to talk to Emma privately during recess to see if I could get a better understanding of what she had written about. When I asked her to explain more about her family's special harvest, she became very excited and started telling me additional details that hadn't been in her essay. Emma told me that the back fields had been in her family for generations, and that her great-grandfather had been the first Richardson to discover that these particular crops would grow there. She said that most people didn't know about the special harvest because it was a family secret, and that her father had made her promise never to talk about it with anyone outside the family. When I asked Emma what happened to the tall ones and quiet ones after they were harvested, she explained that they were sold to people who needed them for important work in other places. She said that her father never told her exactly what kind of work they were used for, but that it must be very important because the customers were willing to pay a lot of money for them. The most chilling moment of our conversation came when I asked Emma if she had ever seen any of the tall ones or quiet ones moving or acting like they were alive. She looked at me with the serious expression that children get when they're trying to explain something important to an adult who doesn't understand. Emma told me that of course they were alive, but that they were sleeping very deeply and wouldn't wake up completely until they reached their final destinations. She said that sometimes they would move a little bit or make soft sounds, but that this was normal and nothing to be worried about. She explained that her father had taught her how to tell the difference between the ones that were sleeping normally and the ones that might be having problems. After my conversation with Emma, I knew that I had to report what I had learned to someone in authority. But I also knew that if I was wrong about what Emma was describing, I could be ruining the reputation of a local farming family based on the imagination of a 9-year-old girl. I decided to call the Oregon State Police and speak to someone in their criminal investigation division. I explained that I was a substitute teacher and that I had concerns about possible child endangerment based on an essay written by one of my students. The detective I spoke to was initially skeptical, but when I read Emma's essay to him over the phone, he agreed that it warranted further investigation. 2 days later, I learned that the state police had obtained a search warrant for the Richardson farm and had conducted a thorough investigation of the property. What they found in the back fields confirmed my worst fears about what Emma had been describing in her essay. The Richardson family had been operating what law enforcement officials described as a human trafficking operation disguised as a farming business. The backfields contained dozens of makeshift graves where victims had been buried in shallow pits and kept in drug-induced comas until they could be transported to buyers in other states. Emma's father and older brother were arrested and charged with multiple counts of kidnapping, human trafficking, and murder. Emma and her mother were taken into protective custody, and Emma was placed in foster care with a family in a different part of the state. The investigation revealed that the Richardson operation had been active for at least 10 years, and that they had been responsible for the disappearances of dozens of people from small towns throughout Oregon and Northern California. The victims included both adults and children, and many of them matched the descriptions of people who had been reported missing from Millbrook and surrounding communities. Emma's essay had described something so horrific that my mind had initially refused to accept that it could be real. But her innocent, matter-of-fact account of helping her family with their special harvest had provided law enforcement with the evidence they needed to shut down a criminal operation that had been hiding in plain sight for years. The most heartbreaking part of this entire experience was realizing that Emma had been raised to believe that participating in these crimes was a normal family tradition. She had no understanding that what her father was doing was wrong, and she had been proud of her role in helping with the harvest. I never saw Emma again after she was placed in foster care, but I often think about her and hope that she has been able to get the help she needs to recover from the trauma of her childhood. I also think about how many other children might be living in situations where they are being taught to participate in criminal activities disguised as family traditions. The Richardson case taught me that evil can hide behind the most ordinary facades, and that sometimes the most innocent voices can reveal the darkest truths. As teachers, we have a responsibility to pay attention to what children tell us, even when their stories seem too disturbing to believe. The Hartwell-Lindbergh property dispute started in 1952 over 18 inches of farmland. By 2019, when both families hired me to settle it once and for all, that 18-inch strip had become a burial ground. What I found when I started measuring that contested boundary line will haunt me until the day I die. I had been working as a licensed land surveyor in rural Minnesota for about 15 years when the Hartwell and Lindbergh families contacted me about resolving their boundary dispute. These kinds of cases were pretty common in farming communities where property lines that had been established decades earlier sometimes became unclear due to missing markers, conflicting deeds, or changes in the landscape over time. What made this particular case unusual was the length of time that the dispute had been going on. According to the documents that both families provided me, The disagreement over the exact location of their shared property line had been ongoing for nearly 70 years. 3 generations of Hartwells and Lindberghs had been arguing over the same strip of land, and the animosity between the families had only gotten worse with each passing decade. The disputed area was a narrow strip of farmland approximately 18 inches wide and about 200 yards long, running along the border between the Hartwell farm to the north and the Lindbergh farm to the south. Both families claimed ownership of this strip, and both had documentation that seemed to support their claims. The Hartwells had a deed from 1951 that described their property as extending to the old stone fence line, which they claimed included the disputed strip. The Lindberghs had a survey from 1953 that showed their property extending to the natural drainage ditch, which they argued was located 18 inches north of where the Hartwells claimed it was. Over the years, both families had tried to resolve the dispute through various means. They had hired lawyers, consulted with other surveyors, and even attempted mediation through the County Agricultural Extension Office. But every attempt at resolution had failed, usually because one family or the other would refuse to accept the proposed solution. By 2019, the situation had reached a crisis point. The current generation of both families was getting older, and they wanted to settle the dispute before they passed the farms on to their children. Both sides were tired of the ongoing conflict, but neither was willing to give up what they believed was rightfully theirs. That's when they decided to hire me to conduct a comprehensive boundary survey using modern GPS technology and historical research to determine the exact location of the property line once and for all. Both families agreed that they would accept my findings as final and legally binding, regardless of which side the decision favored. I started my work by reviewing all of the historical documents related to both properties, including deeds, surveys, tax records, and aerial photographs dating back to the 1940s. I also researched the history of the area to understand how the land had been originally surveyed and divided when it was first settled. What I discovered during my research was that the property dispute was more complex than either family had realized. The original survey of the area had been conducted in 1894, but the surveyor's notes were incomplete and contained several inconsistencies. Additionally, both the old stone fence line and the natural drainage ditch mentioned in the competing deeds had been altered multiple times over the decades, making it difficult to determine their exact historical locations. The next phase of my work involved conducting a physical survey of the disputed area using GPS equipment and traditional surveying tools. This was where things started to get strange. When I began measuring the contested strip of land, I immediately noticed that the soil in that area was different from the surrounding farmland. Instead of the rich black topsoil that covered the rest of both farms, the disputed strip had lighter-colored sandy soil that seemed to have been disturbed relatively recently. I also noticed that nothing grew well in that strip. While the fields on both sides supported healthy crops of corn and soybeans, the vegetation in the disputed area was sparse and sickly looking. The few weeds and grasses that did manage to grow there were stunted and discolored, as if the soil was contaminated with something that inhibited plant growth. At first, I assumed that the poor soil quality was the result of decades of farming practices, or maybe the application of too much fertilizer or herbicide. But as I continued my survey work, I started to suspect that there might be something buried in that strip of land. My suspicions were confirmed when I used ground-penetrating radar to scan the area. The radar readings showed multiple large objects buried at depths ranging from 3 to 6 feet below the surface. The objects were roughly human-sized and were arranged in 2 neat rows running the entire length of the disputed strip. I immediately contacted both families to inform them of what I had found, and I recommended that we stop the survey work and contact law enforcement. but both the Hartwells and the Lindberghs insisted that I continue with the survey and not involve any outside authorities until we had determined the exact nature of what was buried there. Against my better judgment, I agreed to excavate one of the buried objects to see what we were dealing with. What we found made me wish I had called the police immediately. The first object we uncovered was a wooden coffin that appeared to have been buried sometime in the 1950s or early 1960s. Inside the coffin was the body of a man in his 30s or 40s wearing clothes that were consistent with the time period when the coffin was buried. The body was remarkably well preserved, probably due to the sandy soil conditions and the sealed environment inside the coffin. But what made this discovery truly disturbing was that the man had obviously died violently. His skull had been crushed, and there were multiple stab wounds visible in his clothing and the remains of his flesh. This was clearly a murder victim, not someone who had died of natural causes and been buried in a family cemetery. When I showed the body to representatives from both families, their reactions confirmed my worst fears about what we had discovered. Instead of being shocked or horrified by finding a murder victim buried on their property, both families seemed to recognize the deceased man and understand why he was there. Old Henrik Lindbergh, who was in his 80s and the patriarch of the Lindbergh family, looked at the body and said, "That's Bill Morrison. He was asking too many questions about what happened to his brother." Henrik's son nodded in agreement and added, "Dad always said that Bill should have minded his own business." From the Hartwell side, the reaction was similar. Martha Hartwell, who was Henrik's contemporary and the family matriarch, examined the body and said, "I remember when we buried him. It was right after the harvest in 1953. Her grandson asked if they should continue digging up the others, and Martha nodded and said, "Might as well finish what we started." Over the next few hours, we excavated 6 more bodies from the disputed strip. All of them showed signs of violent death, and all of them were recognized by members of both families as people who had supposedly left the area decades earlier, or who had simply disappeared without explanation. The families explained to me that the disputed property strip had been used as a burial ground for anyone who threatened to expose what they called the family business. Both the Hartwells and the Lindberghs had been involved in organized crime activities since the 1940s, including bootlegging during Prohibition, cattle rustling, and later drug trafficking. The reason that both families had claimed ownership of the burial strip was not because they wanted the land for farming, but because they each wanted to control access to the evidence of their crimes. The ongoing property dispute had been a way to ensure that no one else would ever develop or disturb that area. The most disturbing part of this revelation was learning that the violence had continued into recent years. The most recently buried body was that of a man named David Chen, who had disappeared in 2011 after asking too many questions about suspicious activities on the neighboring farms. Both families had participated in his murder and burial, just as they had with all the others. I immediately contacted the FBI and the Minnesota State Police to report what we had discovered. Within hours, both farms were swarming with federal agents and forensic investigators. The entire disputed strip was excavated, revealing a total of 14 bodies spanning nearly 60 years of criminal activity. Both families were arrested and charged with multiple counts of murder, conspiracy, and racketeering. The investigation revealed a criminal enterprise that had operated in the area for decades, with both families working together to eliminate anyone who threatened their operations. The irony of the situation was that the property dispute that had brought me there in the first place had never been real. Both families had manufactured the boundary disagreement as a way to keep attention focused on the legal aspects of the land ownership rather than on what was actually buried there. My work as a land surveyor usually involves helping people resolve legitimate disputes over property boundaries and ownership rights. But in this case, I had been unknowingly hired to help 2 criminal families maintain control over their burial ground. The experience taught me that in rural communities, even the most ordinary seeming property disputes can have dark underlying causes. Long-running conflicts between neighboring families sometimes involve much more than just disagreements over fence lines or drainage ditches. Since the Hartwell-Lindbergh case, I have been much more careful about accepting boundary dispute cases, especially ones involving families that have been in conflict for decades. I always conduct thorough background research on my clients and the properties involved, and I don't hesitate to contact law enforcement if I discover anything suspicious during my survey work. The disputed strip of land is now part of an ongoing federal investigation, and both farms have been seized as evidence in the criminal case. The families who hired me to resolve their property dispute are now serving life sentences in federal prison. Sometimes the boundaries that people fight over aren't just about land ownership. Sometimes they're about protecting secrets that are buried beneath the surface. Emergency dispatch gets weird calls during blizzards, but the call that came in during the January 2023 storm wasn't about being snowed in or power outages. Martha Olson from Township Road 15 was calling because her weather radio was broadcasting forecasts for places that don't exist, and the voice giving the reports belonged to her husband, who'd been dead for 6 years. I had been working as an emergency services dispatcher for McLean County for about 8 years when that call came in. Most of my experience was with typical rural emergencies, farm accidents, medical calls to isolated homes, and the occasional search and rescue when someone got lost during hunting season. Winter storms always brought their own set of challenges, mostly power outages and people getting stranded on back roads, but nothing that prepared me for what Martha Olson reported that night. The January 2023 blizzard was one of the worst storms to hit central North Dakota in decades. Wind gusts up to 70 miles per hour, temperatures dropping to 40 below zero, and snowfall so heavy that visibility was reduced to just a few feet. We had been fielding emergency calls for 3 straight days, mostly from people whose furnaces had failed or who needed medical assistance but couldn't get to the hospital due to impassable roads. Martha's call came in around 2 in the morning on the 3rd night of the storm. I recognized her voice immediately because she had called dispatch several times over the years, usually for minor medical issues related to her diabetes or to report suspicious vehicles on the rural roads near her farm. She was a reliable caller, the kind of person who only contacted emergency services when she genuinely needed help. But this call was different from anything I had ever received. Martha sounded frightened and confused, and she kept apologizing for bothering us during the storm. She explained that she had been listening to her weather radio to track the progress of the blizzard when it started broadcasting forecasts for locations that she had never heard of. Places with names like Coldwater Junction and White Rock Township and Millerville Crossing. At first, I assumed that her radio was picking up transmissions from a different state or maybe even Canada, which sometimes happened during severe weather when atmospheric conditions could cause radio signals to travel much farther than normal. I was about to explain this to Martha when she told me the part that made my blood run cold. Martha said that the voice giving the weather forecasts sounded exactly like her husband Harold, who had died of a heart attack in 2017. She insisted that it wasn't just a similar voice or someone who reminded her of Harold. She was absolutely certain that it was Harold's voice, complete with his distinctive accent and the way he pronounced certain words. I had met Harold Olson several times during my years as a dispatcher. He had been a volunteer with our emergency response team, helping with search and rescue operations and severe weather spotting. He had a very distinctive way of speaking with a slight Norwegian accent that reflected his family's heritage, and he always ended his radio transmissions with the phrase 73 and stay safe, which was ham radio code for best wishes. Martha told me that the voice on her weather radio was using Harold's exact speech patterns, and even ending each forecast with 73 and stay safe. She had been listening to the broadcasts for over an hour, and each forecast was for a different fictional location, but they were all delivered in Harold's unmistakable voice. I tried to calm Martha down and suggested that the storm might be causing her radio to malfunction or pick up unusual signals. But she insisted that the radio was working perfectly and that the forecasts were clear and detailed, just like regular National Weather Service broadcasts. She offered to hold the phone up to the radio so I could hear the transmissions myself. When Martha held her phone near the weather radio, I could clearly hear a male voice giving detailed weather forecasts. The voice was professional and authoritative, just like a trained meteorologist, but it was also somehow familiar in a way that made me uncomfortable. The forecast was for a place called Deadwood Prairie, predicting continued blizzard conditions with wind gusts up to 80 miles per hour and snowfall accumulations of 18 to 24 inches. What made the broadcast truly disturbing was that it ended with the phrase 73 and stay safe, delivered in the exact tone and cadence that I remembered from Harold Olsen's emergency radio transmissions. I had heard Harold use that sign-off dozens of times during my years as a dispatcher, and there was no mistaking his distinctive way of saying it. I told Martha that I would send a deputy to check on her as soon as the roads were passable, but she said that wasn't necessary. She just wanted someone to know what was happening in case something went wrong. She also asked me if I could check our records to see if there had ever been places called Coldwater Junction or White Rock Township in McLean County, because the weather reports were describing local landmarks and road conditions that seemed familiar even though the town names were completely unknown to her. After I finished the call with Martha, I spent the rest of my shift researching the place names that she had mentioned. I checked historical maps, county records, and even old telephone directories, but I couldn't find any reference to Coldwater Junction, White Rock Township, Millerville Crossing, or any of the other locations that had been mentioned in the weather forecasts. However, I did discover something that made the situation even more unsettling. When I looked at modern maps of McLean County and the surrounding area, I noticed that many of the geographic features mentioned in the fictional weather forecasts actually existed. There really was a Deadwood Prairie, though it was just an unnamed section of grassland about 20 miles north of Martha's farm. There were also several creeks, hills, and other landmarks that had been accurately described in the mysterious broadcasts. It was as if someone with detailed knowledge of the local geography was creating fictional towns and townships in real locations, then broadcasting weather forecasts for these imaginary communities using Harold Olsen's voice and speech patterns. 2 days later, when the storm finally passed and the roads were cleared, I drove out to Martha's farm to check on her and to listen to her weather radio myself. Martha was relieved to see me, and she explained that the strange broadcasts had continued throughout the entire storm, always featuring different fictional locations, but always delivered in Harold's distinctive voice. She led me to her kitchen where she kept the weather radio, a standard National Weather Service receiver that was tuned to the local emergency broadcast frequency. When she turned it on, we could hear normal weather updates from the Bismarck office, with current conditions and forecasts for real cities and counties in the region. But Martha said that the mysterious broadcasts only occurred during severe weather events, and only late at night when most people would be asleep. She had been keeping a log of all the fictional place names and weather conditions that had been reported, and she showed me pages of notes written in her careful handwriting. The locations mentioned in the broadcasts formed a pattern that was both fascinating and disturbing. All of the fictional towns and townships were located in areas where real communities had existed decades earlier, but had been abandoned due to economic hardship or natural disasters. Coldwater Junction had been built on the site of a railroad town that was abandoned in the 1930s. White Rock Township corresponded to an area where several farming families had lived until the Dust Bowl forced them to relocate. It was as if the mysterious broadcaster was creating weather forecasts for ghost towns, communities that had once existed but were now just empty fields and forgotten foundations. And the person delivering these forecasts was using the voice of Harold Olson, a man who had spent his entire life in McLean County and would have known the history of every abandoned settlement in the area. Martha also told me something that she hadn't mentioned during her emergency call. She said that the weather forecasts weren't just describing current conditions. They were also including historical information about the fictional communities, mentioning families who had lived there, businesses that had operated, and events that had supposedly taken place decades earlier. Some of these historical details matched real information about the abandoned settlements that had once existed in those locations. The broadcasts would mention family names that appeared in old county records, or describe businesses that had actually operated in the ghost towns before they were abandoned. I contacted the National Weather Service office in Bismarck to report the unusual radio transmissions, but they had no record of any unauthorized broadcasts on their frequency. They suggested that Martha's radio might be malfunctioning or that she might be picking up transmissions from amateur radio operators who were using their equipment inappropriately. But I knew that wasn't the explanation. I had heard Harold Olson's voice too many times to mistake it for someone else, and the level of historical detail in the broadcasts suggested access to information that would be difficult for a prankster to obtain. Over the next year, Martha continued to receive the mysterious weather forecasts during severe storms. She called me several times to report new fictional locations and to share additional historical information that had been included in the broadcasts. Each time I verified that the places didn't exist on modern maps, but corresponded to areas where real communities had once thrived. The most disturbing call came in December 2023, almost a year after the first incident. Martha reported that the weather radio had broadcast a forecast for Olson's Corners, a fictional township located exactly where Harold Olson's family farm had been before it was sold after his death. The forecast had included detailed information about the Olson family history, mentioning Harold's parents and grandparents by name and describing events that had taken place on the farm over the past century. The broadcast had ended with Harold's voice saying, "This is your final forecast for Olson's Corners. The weather ahead is clear and calm. 73 and stay safe, Martha." Martha never received another mysterious weather broadcast after that night. Her radio returned to normal operation, receiving only official National Weather Service transmissions. But she told me that she still turns on the weather radio during every storm, hoping to hear Harold's voice one more time, delivering forecasts for places that exist only in memory and in the voices of the dead who refuse to let them be forgotten. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Buried Files. Tonight we return with another collection of disturbing accounts that have been carefully documented and preserved from the darkest corners of Oregon. In this episode, we will journey through 6 harrowing tales of human encounters with forces that defy explanation. Each story drawn from real testimonies of individuals who survived experiences that forever changed their understanding of what lurks in the shadows of the Pacific Northwest. From Forest Service rangers to coastal patrol officers, from urban explorers to farm workers, these witnesses have come forward to share their most terrifying encounters with phenomena that exist beyond the boundaries of conventional understanding. Each narrative has been meticulously researched and reconstructed from detailed accounts provided by those who lived through these events. To protect the privacy and safety of those involved, certain names and identifying details have been carefully altered while preserving the essential truth of their experiences. If you are new here, make sure to subscribe to Buried Files for daily collections of true horror content that will challenge everything you thought you knew about our world. Hit that notification bell so you never miss when we uncover the next buried truth. Let us know in the comments below which Oregon location you would never visit alone after hearing these stories. After 15 years working for the Oregon Forest Service, I thought I had seen everything these woods could throw at me. I was wrong, and what happened last October in the Deschutes National Forest ended my career. My name is Joshua, and I used to patrol the backcountry areas where most people never venture. It was my job to monitor trail conditions, check for illegal camping, and ensure hikers stayed safe in some of the most remote wilderness Oregon has to offer. I loved that job more than anything in my life, which makes what I am about to tell you that much harder to accept. The incident happened during what should have been a routine patrol of the Three Sisters Wilderness area. I had been assigned to check a section of trail that had been closed to the public for 3 months due to reported landslide damage. The area was about 12 miles from the nearest road, accessible only on foot through dense pine and fir forest that stretched for miles in every direction. I had hiked this particular section dozens of times over the years, and I knew every landmark, every stream crossing, and every potential hazard along the way. That morning started like any other. I loaded my pack with the usual gear, emergency supplies, radio equipment, and my service weapon. The weather forecast called for clear skies and moderate temperatures, perfect conditions for a long day hike into the wilderness. I signed out at the ranger station at 6:30 in the morning and began the trek to the closed trail section. The first few hours passed without incident as I made my way along familiar paths, documenting trail conditions and taking photographs of areas that would need maintenance attention. The trouble started around 11 in the morning when I reached the section that had reportedly suffered landslide damage. According to the incident report filed 3 months earlier, a massive rock slide had completely blocked the trail, making it impassable for hikers. But when I arrived at the coordinates listed in the report, I found the trail completely clear. There was no evidence of any rock slide, no debris, no damaged trees, nothing that would suggest any kind of geological event had occurred in the area. The trail looked exactly as it had during my last patrol 6 months earlier. I spent nearly an hour examining the area, taking photographs and measurements to document what I was seeing. According to my GPS unit, I was definitely in the right location. The coordinates matched perfectly with those listed in the incident report, but there was absolutely no sign of the landslide that had supposedly closed this section of trail. I radioed back to the ranger station to report my findings, but I could not get through. The radio crackled with static, which was unusual given that I had tested the equipment that morning and confirmed it was working properly. I decided to continue along the trail to see if perhaps the landslide had occurred further ahead than originally reported. The path wound through increasingly dense forest with towering Douglas firs creating a thick canopy overhead. The undergrowth was heavy with ferns and moss, and the air carried that distinctive smell of decomposing pine needles and damp earth that you only find deep in old-growth forests. Everything seemed normal, peaceful even, until I noticed something that made me stop dead in my tracks. The forest had gone completely silent. No bird songs, no rustling of small animals in the underbrush, no buzzing of insects. The only sound was my own breathing and the soft crunch of pine needles under my boots. In 15 years of working in these woods, I had never experienced such complete and unnatural silence. Every instinct I had developed during my career was telling me that something was very wrong. I stood motionless for several minutes, listening carefully for any sound that might explain the eerie quiet that had settled over the forest. That was when I first heard it, a low humming sound that seemed to come from somewhere ahead of me on the trail. It was barely audible at first, more of a vibration that I felt in my chest than an actual sound. But as I stood there listening, it gradually grew louder and more distinct. The humming had an almost mechanical quality to it, like the sound of distant machinery or electrical equipment. But there were no power lines in this area, no buildings, no roads, nothing that could produce such a sound. I pulled out my GPS unit to confirm my location and verify that I had not somehow wandered off course. The display showed that I was still following the designated trail, miles from any human development. I decided to investigate the source of the humming sound, moving carefully along the trail with all my senses on high alert. The sound grew gradually louder as I advanced, and I began to notice other unusual signs. The trees along the trail appeared to be dying, their needles brown and brittle despite the fact that it was still early fall. The undergrowth was sparse and sickly looking, as if something had drained all the life from the forest floor. After walking for another 10 minutes, I came to a small clearing that I had never seen before, despite having hiked this trail numerous times over the years. The clearing was perfectly circular, about 50 feet in diameter and completely devoid of vegetation. The ground was bare dirt, packed hard like concrete with strange geometric patterns etched into the surface. The humming sound was much louder here, and I could feel it resonating through the soles of my boots. At the center of the clearing stood what I can only describe as some kind of structure, though it defied any conventional architectural description. It appeared to be made of a dark metallic material that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The structure was roughly cylindrical, about 8 feet tall and 4 feet in diameter, with no visible seams, joints, or openings. The surface was covered with the same geometric patterns that were etched into the ground, and the entire thing seemed to pulse with a faint, otherworldly energy. I approached the structure cautiously, every fiber of my being screaming at me to turn around and leave immediately. But my training and professional curiosity compelled me to investigate further. I needed to document what I was seeing, to gather evidence that could be analyzed and explained by people with more expertise than I possessed. I pulled out my camera and began taking photographs from multiple angles, making sure to capture both the structure itself and the strange patterns carved into the clearing floor. As I moved around the structure taking pictures, I noticed that my compass was spinning wildly, unable to settle on any consistent direction. My GPS unit had stopped working entirely, displaying only error messages when I tried to determine my location. Even more disturbing, my watch had stopped, the hands frozen at exactly 11:47, though I was certain it had been working properly when I checked it earlier. The humming sound began to change, becoming more complex and varied, almost like some kind of alien language or communication system. I could feel the vibrations growing stronger, penetrating deep into my body and making my bones ache. The air around the structure began to shimmer like heat waves rising from hot pavement. Though the temperature felt normal, that was when I saw them. At first, they were just shadows moving at the edge of the clearing, barely visible in my peripheral vision. But as I focused my attention on them, the shadows became more distinct, more solid. They were humanoid in shape, but wrong in every detail. Too tall, too thin, with movements that seemed to flow rather than walk. Their faces, if they could be called faces, were featureless and dark, like voids in the shape of human heads. There were 3 of them that I could see clearly, though I had the sense that more were present just beyond the tree line. They moved with purpose, circling the clearing in a pattern that seemed to mirror the geometric designs carved into the ground. They paid no attention to me at first, as if I were invisible or irrelevant to whatever they were doing. I continued taking photographs, though my hands were shaking so badly that I was not sure any of the images would be usable. Part of me wanted to run to get as far away from that clearing as possible. But another part, the professional part that had served me well during my career, insisted that I needed to document everything I was witnessing. This was beyond anything in my training or experience, but it was real, and it was happening in a forest that was under my protection. One of the shadow figures suddenly stopped moving and turned in my direction. Even though it had no visible eyes or facial features, I could feel its attention focused on me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. It raised what might have been an arm and pointed directly at me. The humming sound changed again, becoming sharper and more urgent, almost threatening in its tone. The other figures stopped their circling and also turned toward me. I felt a wave of something, not heat or cold, but some other form of energy that made every nerve in my body scream in alarm. My camera stopped working, the display going dark despite a full battery. My radio, which had been producing only static, went completely dead. Even the digital display on my GPS unit flickered and went blank. I knew that I had to leave immediately. Every survival instinct I possessed was telling me that I was in mortal danger. I backed slowly toward the tree line, never taking my eyes off the shadow figures. They did not follow me, but I could feel their attention tracking my every movement. The humming sound grew louder and more aggressive, as if warning me never to return. Once I reached the safety of the forest, I turned and ran. I ran harder and faster than I had ever run in my life, crashing through undergrowth and leaping over fallen logs in my desperate need to put distance between myself and that clearing. I did not stop running until I reached my vehicle, and even then I could still feel the phantom vibrations of that alien humming in my bones. The drive back to the ranger station was a blur of conflicting emotions and racing thoughts. How could I possibly report what I had witnessed? Who would believe such an impossible story? But I had to try. I had a professional and moral obligation to document the incident and ensure that other people did not stumble into whatever was lurking in that clearing. When I arrived at the station, I immediately went to my supervisor and requested a private meeting. I told him everything, describing the clearing, the structure, and the shadow figures in as much detail as I could remember. He listened patiently, occasionally asking clarifying questions, but his expression grew increasingly skeptical as my story progressed. When I finished my account, he asked to see the photographs I had taken. I handed over my camera, but when we reviewed the images, they showed nothing but normal forest scenes. The clearing was not visible in any of the pictures, nor was the strange structure or the shadow figures. According to the camera, I had spent the day hiking through perfectly ordinary woodland. My supervisor suggested that I might be suffering from altitude sickness or dehydration, both of which could cause hallucinations and disorientation. He recommended that I take a few days off to rest and recover, and then we would discuss the incident further. But I knew what I had seen was real despite the lack of photographic evidence. Over the next several days, I tried to convince myself that maybe my supervisor was right. Maybe I had experienced some kind of medical episode that caused me to hallucinate the entire incident. But deep down, I knew that was not the case. The memory of that clearing was too vivid, too detailed, too consistent to be dismissed as a hallucination. I requested permission to return to the area with a partner, but my supervisor denied the request. He cited safety concerns and suggested that I focus on less remote assignments until I had fully recovered from whatever had affected me during the patrol. But I could see in his eyes that he thought I was losing my grip on reality. The final straw came 3 weeks later when I tried to access the incident report that had originally sent me to investigate the landslide. According to the filing system, no such report existed. There was no record of any landslide in that area, no closure order for the trail, and no assignment for me to investigate. According to the official records, I had never been sent to that section of the Deschutes National Forest. When I confronted my supervisor about the missing paperwork, he became defensive and suggested that I might be confusing details from different assignments. He implied that my mental state was deteriorating and that perhaps it was time for me to consider early retirement. The message was clear: stop pursuing this matter or face the consequences. I realized that whatever was happening in that clearing was being covered up at levels far above my pay grade. Someone or something did not want that area investigated or documented. My choice was simple: stay quiet and keep my job, or continue asking questions and face termination. I chose to resign. I could not continue working for an organization that would hide something so significant from the public. People had a right to know about the dangers lurking in our national forests, even if those dangers defied conventional explanation. That was 6 months ago. I have not returned to the Deschutes National Forest since then, and I have no intention of ever going back. But sometimes, late at night when the wind is blowing through the trees outside my house, I swear I can still hear that alien humming sound calling to me from the depths of the Oregon wilderness. I know most people will not believe my story, just as my former supervisor did not believe it. But I also know that what I experienced in that clearing was real, regardless of what the official records might say. There are things in our forests that we do not understand, things that someone in authority has decided we are better off not knowing about. All I can do now is warn others to be careful when venturing into remote wilderness areas. Stay on marked trails, travel with partners, and trust your instincts if something feels wrong. The forest may look peaceful and welcoming, but there are places where the normal rules of reality do not apply. And those places are far more dangerous than any wild animal you might encounter. If you ever find yourself in a clearing where no birds sing and no insects buzz, where strange structures rise from geometric patterns carved into lifeless earth, do not investigate, do not take photographs, do not try to understand what you are seeing. Just run and never look back. I have been doing Oregon Trail reenactments for 8 years, always trying to make the experience as authentic as possible. But during our 2024 journey near Baker City, we discovered that some parts of history should never be relived. My name is Olivia, and what I am about to tell you is why I will never participate in another historical reenactment as long as I live. For those who do not know what Oregon Trail reenactments involve, we are a group of history enthusiasts who spend weeks each summer recreating the journey that pioneers made across the American West in the 1800s. We use authentic equipment, dress in period clothing, and follow the same routes that thousands of families traveled over 150 years ago. The goal is to gain a deeper understanding of the hardships and challenges faced by those brave souls who helped build this country. Our group consisted of 12 adults and 6 children ranging in age from 8 to 62. We had been planning this particular reenactment for 2 years, working with historians and local authorities to map out an authentic route through eastern Oregon that would take us along some of the lesser-known segments of the original Oregon Trail. The journey was scheduled to last 3 weeks, covering approximately 180 miles of challenging terrain. I had been elected as the wagon master for this expedition, which meant I was responsible for coordinating our daily movements, ensuring everyone stayed safe, and maintaining the historical accuracy of our experience. I took this role very seriously, spending months researching the specific challenges faced by pioneer families in this region during the 1840s and 1850s. Our preparation was extensive. We had authentic covered wagons pulled by oxen, period-appropriate clothing and tools, and historically accurate food supplies including hardtack, dried beans, and salted meat. We carried no modern conveniences except for emergency communication equipment and basic medical supplies, both of which were kept hidden from sight to maintain the illusion of authenticity. The first week of our journey went exactly as planned. The weather was favorable, our oxen were strong and healthy, and the group was in high spirits. We followed wagon ruts that were still visible after more than a century, camping each night in locations that had been used by actual pioneer families during their westward migration. The children in our group were especially excited, treating the entire experience like the ultimate educational adventure. But everything changed during our second week, when we reached a section of the trail near Baker City that none of us had ever traveled before. According to our historical maps, this area had been the site of several tragic incidents during the peak years of Oregon Trail migration. Families had been forced to abandon wagons and possessions when the terrain became too difficult to navigate. Some had died from disease, others from accidents, and a few had simply disappeared without explanation. The landscape in this region was harsh and unforgiving, with rocky terrain, steep hills, and very little water. The original pioneers had struggled mightily to cross this section, and we were beginning to understand why. Our oxen were having difficulty pulling the wagons over the rough ground, and we were forced to stop frequently to rest both the animals and ourselves. It was during one of these rest stops that we first noticed something unusual. While examining the ground around our campsite, one of our group members discovered what appeared to be remnants of an old wagon wheel, partially buried in the dirt and rocks. This was not uncommon along the Oregon Trail, as pioneers were often forced to abandon equipment that became too damaged or burdensome to continue carrying. But as we examined the wheel more closely, we realized it was in remarkably good condition for something that should have been over 150 years old. The wood showed signs of age and weathering, but it had not rotted or disintegrated the way we would have expected. More disturbing, there were dark stains on the wood that looked suspiciously like dried blood. Our group historian, a retired professor named Margaret, suggested that we might have discovered an artifact from one of the documented tragedies that had occurred in this area. She pulled out her research materials and confirmed that at least 3 separate wagon trains had reported serious incidents at this location, including accidents, illness, and attacks by hostile parties. That night, as we sat around our campfire eating our simple meal of beans and hardtack, Margaret shared some of the historical accounts she had uncovered during her research. The stories were darker than any of us had expected, involving not just the typical hardships of frontier life, but also violence, betrayal, and mysterious disappearances that had never been properly explained. One account from 1847 described a family of 7 who had stopped to rest in this exact area after their wagon broke down. When a search party found them 3 days later, the parents and oldest children were missing, and the 2 youngest children were found hiding in the wagon, too traumatized to speak. The children eventually told authorities that strange people had come in the night, people who looked like pioneers but acted wrong, moving and talking in ways that frightened them. Another story from 1852 involved a wagon train of 23 families who camped in this region for 2 nights while making repairs to their equipment. On the second night, several members of the group reported hearing voices calling to them from the darkness, voices that sounded like family members who were supposed to be sleeping in their wagons. When they investigated, they found their actual family members safe in their beds with no explanation for the voices they had heard. The most disturbing account came from 1856, when a group of 15 pioneers reported encountering what they described as a phantom wagon train. According to their testimony, they had seen another group of travelers moving parallel to their route, always staying just at the edge of visibility. When they attempted to make contact with these other pioneers, hoping to join forces for mutual protection, the phantom group would disappear entirely, only to reappear in a different location hours later. As Margaret shared these historical accounts, I noticed that several members of our group were becoming increasingly uncomfortable. The children especially seemed frightened by the stories, and I began to worry that our pursuit of historical authenticity might be having a negative impact on what was supposed to be an educational and enjoyable experience. But it was too late to change course. We were committed to following the historical route, and we were already 2 weeks into our journey with only 1 week remaining. We had invested too much time, money, and effort to abandon the expedition based on old stories and legends that probably had perfectly rational explanations. That night, I lay in my bedroll listening to the sounds of the wilderness around us. The wind through the sagebrush, the distant cry of coyotes, and the occasional snort or shifting movement of our oxen as they grazed nearby. But mixed in with these natural sounds, I began to hear something else. Voices, very faint and distant, that seemed to be coming from somewhere beyond our campsite. At first, I assumed it was other members of our group talking quietly around the dying embers of our campfire. But when I raised my head to look, I could see that everyone in our camp was asleep. The voices were coming from somewhere else, somewhere in the darkness beyond the circle of light cast by our fire. I listened carefully, trying to determine what the voices were saying and where exactly they were coming from. They seemed to be having a conversation, multiple people discussing something in urgent, hushed tones. But I could not make out the specific words, and the sound seemed to move around our campsite, coming first from one direction and then from another. I considered waking the others, but I did not want to cause unnecessary alarm over what might simply be travelers camped somewhere nearby. Instead, I lay quietly and continued to listen, hoping the voices would either stop or become clear enough for me to understand what was being said. After nearly an hour of listening to the mysterious conversation, I finally heard something that made my blood run cold. One of the voices clearly called out the name of Margaret, our group historian, not shouting her name as if trying to get her attention, but discussing her in the same hushed tone that had characterized the entire conversation. I sat up immediately, my heart pounding with a mixture of fear and confusion. Someone was out there in the darkness talking about one of our group members by name. This was no coincidence, and it was certainly not a group of innocent travelers who happened to be camping nearby. I quietly made my way over to where Margaret was sleeping and gently shook her awake. When she opened her eyes, I put my finger to my lips and pointed toward the darkness where the voices were coming from. She sat up slowly, listening carefully, and after a few minutes she heard them too. We woke the other adults in our group one by one, being careful not to disturb the sleeping children. Soon we had 8 adults sitting quietly around the remains of our campfire, all listening to the mysterious voices that continued to drift through the darkness around us. The conversation seemed to be focused on our group specifically, discussing our movements, our equipment, and individual members by name. They knew details about our journey that no outsider should have known, including our planned route for the following day and the specific supplies we were carrying in our wagons. One of the men in our group, a retired military officer named Robert, suggested that we might be dealing with modern-day thieves who had been monitoring our expedition and were planning to rob us of our authentic historical equipment and supplies. Some of our wagons, oxen, and period artifacts were worth considerable money, and we were carrying everything in isolated wilderness areas where criminal activity would be difficult to detect or investigate. But as we continued to listen to the voices, it became clear that this was not a simple robbery scheme. The people talking about us were discussing our journey in ways that suggested they knew far more about the historical Oregon Trail than any ordinary criminals would know. They referenced specific events from the 1800s, mentioned families and individuals who had traveled this route over 150 years ago, and spoke about our reenactment as if it were somehow connected to those long-ago tragedies. Margaret grabbed her research materials and began looking through her historical accounts, comparing what the voices were saying to the documented incidents she had uncovered. The correlation was undeniable. The voices were referencing the same families, the same tragedies, and the same mysterious disappearances that had been reported in this area during the peak years of Oregon Trail migration. As dawn began to break, the voices gradually faded away, leaving us exhausted and deeply unsettled. We had spent the entire night listening to people discuss our expedition in detail, but we had never seen who was talking or determined where they were located. Despite searching the area around our campsite, we found no evidence that anyone else had been nearby during the night. We faced a difficult decision. We could continue with our planned route, hoping that the previous night had been an isolated incident, or we could abandon our carefully planned expedition and head for the nearest town. The rational part of me wanted to continue, to maintain the historical authenticity of our journey and complete what we had started. But the protective part of me was deeply concerned about the safety of the children in our group. The decision was made for us later that morning when we discovered that one of our wagons had been damaged during the night. The canvas top had been slashed in multiple places and several of our essential supplies had been stolen, including most of our remaining food and all of our medical supplies. Whoever had been talking about us in the darkness had also taken action against us. Robert conducted a thorough investigation of the crime scene, using his military training to look for clues about who might have been responsible for the theft and vandalism. What he found was more disturbing than the crime itself. The footprints around our damaged wagon were not from modern hiking boots or work shoes, but from what appeared to be authentic period footwear. The kind of leather boots and shoes that pioneers would have worn during the 1800s. More unsettling, the method used to slash our wagon canvas was not consistent with a modern knife or blade, but rather with the kind of rough, improvised cutting tools that would have been available to travelers on the original Oregon Trail. Someone was not just stealing from us, but doing so in a way that was historically authentic to the period we were trying to recreate. We had no choice but to abandon our expedition. With our food supplies stolen and our wagon damaged, we could not safely continue our journey, especially with children in our group. We loaded our remaining supplies into the undamaged wagons and began the difficult trek back toward the nearest town where we could get help and contact authorities about the theft. The return journey was tense and frightening. We moved as quickly as possible while constantly watching for signs that we were being followed or observed. Several times during that first day, members of our group reported seeing figures in the distance, people dressed in period clothing who seemed to be shadowing our movements but always staying just far enough away to avoid clear identification. On our final night before reaching town, we experienced the most terrifying incident of the entire expedition. As we set up camp in what we hoped would be a safe location near a well-traveled road, we began to hear the voices again. But this time, they were not discussing our movements from a distance. They were calling to us directly, trying to convince members of our group to leave the safety of our campsite and come into the darkness. The voices claimed to be other reenactors who had become separated from their own group and needed our help. They knew the names of several people in our expedition and referenced specific details about our journey that made their claims seem plausible. But Robert and I recognized the voices from the night before, and we knew that this was some kind of trap or trick designed to lure us away from our group. The most chilling moment came when one of the voices called out to Margaret specifically, claiming to be her research partner from the university, and insisting that he had discovered evidence of an important historical artifact nearby. The voice knew details about Margaret's academic work that no stranger should have known, and for a moment even she seemed tempted to investigate. We managed to keep everyone together until morning, but it required constant vigilance and repeated reminders that nothing good could come from venturing into the darkness to meet mysterious strangers who claimed to need our help. The children were especially frightened by the voices calling to them, and several of the adults admitted later that they had felt an almost irresistible urge to respond to the calls. When we finally reached town the next day, we immediately contacted local law enforcement to report the theft and harassment we had experienced during our expedition. The sheriff listened to our account with a mixture of skepticism and concern, clearly having difficulty believing that we had been systematically stalked and robbed by people dressed as 1800s pioneers. But when we mentioned the specific location where the incidents had occurred, his expression changed dramatically. He explained that our group was not the first to report strange encounters in that particular area. Over the years, several other historical reenactment groups, hiking parties, and even some local residents had described similar experiences involving mysterious figures in period clothing who seemed to know far more about visitors than they should. The sheriff suggested that we might be dealing with a group of individuals who had become obsessed with Oregon Trail history to the point where they were living out some kind of elaborate fantasy in the wilderness. These people might be using their extensive historical knowledge to intimidate and rob visitors while maintaining the illusion that they were somehow connected to the original pioneer experience. But he also mentioned a darker possibility that had been discussed among local law enforcement. There had been several unexplained disappearances in the region over the years involving people who had last been seen hiking or camping in areas associated with Oregon Trail history. While there was no concrete evidence connecting these disappearances to the mysterious figures that visitors kept reporting, the correlation was troubling enough to warrant serious concern. We never recovered our stolen supplies or received any explanation for the harassment we had experienced during our expedition. The case remained open but inactive, with local authorities occasionally following up on similar reports but never making any arrests or gathering definitive evidence about who was responsible for the ongoing incidents. I disbanded our reenactment group after that experience, and I have never participated in another Oregon Trail expedition. Several other members of our group reported having nightmares for months afterward, dreams involving the voices calling to them from the darkness and mysterious figures in period clothing who seemed to know intimate details about their personal lives. Margaret continued her historical research for a while, but she eventually abandoned her Oregon Trail project as well. She told me later that she could no longer read accounts of pioneer tragedies without hearing those voices from the wilderness, and that the entire subject had become too psychologically disturbing for her to continue studying. The children in our group were perhaps affected most severely by the experience. Several of them developed anxiety about camping or spending time outdoors, and their parents reported that they would wake up in the middle of the night claiming to hear voices calling their names from outside their bedrooms. I still believe that historical reenactments can be valuable educational experiences when conducted safely and appropriately. But I also know that there are some places and some periods of history that should be left undisturbed. The Oregon Trail represents one of the most challenging and tragic chapters in American pioneer history, involving thousands of deaths, countless hardships, and mysteries that have never been solved. Perhaps some of those mysteries are meant to remain unsolved. Perhaps the voices we heard in the darkness were echoes of tragedies that occurred more than 150 years ago, still playing out in places where the boundary between past and present has become dangerously thin. Or perhaps we encountered something far more concrete and threatening. A group of people who have become so obsessed with recreating the past that they have lost touch with the present. Either way, I learned that there are limits to how authentic a historical experience should be, and that some parts of history are too dangerous to relive. The Oregon Trail claimed thousands of lives during the years of westward migration, and it may still be claiming lives today. I urge anyone interested in Oregon Trail history to study it from the safety of libraries and museums rather than venturing into the wilderness areas where those original tragedies occurred. Some experiences are meant to remain in the past, and some voices are meant to remain silent. The lessons of history are important, but they should never come at the cost of modern lives and safety. The trail west was difficult enough for the original pioneers who had no choice but to travel it. Those of us who do have a choice should choose wisely. Working maintenance at Crater Lake during the off-season means months of complete isolation. It is just you, the snow, and that impossibly deep water. But in February of 2023, I realized I was not as alone as I thought. My name is Christopher, and for 12 years I have been part of the park maintenance crew that keeps Crater Lake National Park running when the tourists are gone and the roads are buried under 15 feet of snow. Most people do not realize what it takes to maintain a place like Crater Lake through the winter months. We are talking about one of the most remote locations in Oregon, accessible only by snowcat or skis for nearly 6 months of the year. The park officially closes to vehicle traffic in November, and we do not see regular visitors again until late May or June. During those winter months, only a skeleton crew of maintenance workers, rangers, and emergency personnel remain on site. I have always loved the isolation that comes with winter work at Crater Lake. There is something peaceful about being surrounded by pristine wilderness, with nothing but the sound of wind through the pine trees and the occasional crack of ice shifting on the lake surface. The work is hard, physical labor in brutal conditions, but it has always been worth it for the solitude and the connection to one of the most beautiful places on Earth. Our crew of 4 was responsible for maintaining the visitor center, the lodge facilities, and the critical infrastructure that keeps the park operational during the winter closure. We lived in staff quarters at the rim, isolated from the outside world for weeks at a time. Communication with the outside was limited to radio contact with park headquarters and emergency services, and even that was often unreliable due to weather conditions and the mountainous terrain. The incident began during one of the worst blizzards I have ever experienced at the lake. We had been dealing with a series of winter storms that had dumped more than 8 feet of fresh snow in less than a week. The wind was howling constantly, creating whiteout conditions that made it impossible to see more than a few feet in any direction. We were essentially trapped in our quarters, waiting for the weather to break so we could assess the damage to park facilities. It was during the 3rd night of the storm that I first heard the sounds. I was lying in my bunk, listening to the wind rattling the windows, when I became aware of something else mixed in with the storm noise. It sounded like voices, multiple people talking in urgent, hushed tones. At first, I assumed it was one of my co-workers using a radio or maybe watching something on their tablet. But when I got up to investigate, I found that everyone else was sound asleep. I returned to my bunk, telling myself that I had been hearing things. The isolation and constant storm noise could play tricks on your mind, and I had experienced auditory hallucinations during previous winter assignments. But the voices continued, becoming clearer and more distinct as I lay there listening. They seemed to be coming from outside the building, somewhere in the storm. The next morning, when the wind finally died down enough for us to venture outside, I mentioned what I had heard to my supervisor. He listened with the kind of patient attention that suggested he had dealt with similar reports before. He explained that the extreme isolation and sensory deprivation of winter work could cause people to hear things that were not there, and that it was nothing to be concerned about unless it interfered with my work performance. But I knew what I had heard, and it had not sounded like a hallucination. The voices had been too clear, too consistent, too purposeful. They had been discussing something specific, though I could not make out the exact words. More disturbing, they had seemed to be moving around the building as if a group of people were conducting some kind of patrol or search in the middle of a blizzard. Over the next few days, as we worked to clear snow from the visitor center and assess storm damage to park facilities, I found myself constantly listening for the voices. I did not hear them during the day, but every night they returned. Always the same pattern, starting sometime after midnight and continuing until just before dawn. Always the same urgent, hushed tones, as if people were discussing something they did not want to be overheard. The other members of our crew did not report hearing anything unusual, which made me question my own sanity. I began to wonder if the isolation was affecting me more than I had realized. I had worked winter assignments at Crater Lake for over a decade, but this was the most severe weather I had ever experienced, and we had been cut off from outside contact for longer than usual due to the repeated storms. But my doubts about what I was hearing ended abruptly during my fourth night at the lake. I was lying awake listening to the voices outside when I heard something that made my blood freeze. One of the voices clearly said my name, not shouting it, not calling out to me, but discussing me in the same hushed tone they used for everything else. "Christopher is in the East Wing," the voice said, as clearly as if someone had been standing next to my bed. I sat up immediately, my heart pounding with a mixture of fear and anger. Someone was outside our building in the middle of a blizzard talking about me specifically. I got out of bed, pulled on my winter gear, and grabbed a powerful flashlight from my equipment kit. I was going to find out who was out there and what they wanted. The moment I stepped outside, I realized how foolish I was being. The storm was still raging, though not as violently as the previous nights. The temperature was well below zero, and the wind chill made it feel even colder. No rational person would be outside in these conditions unless they were in immediate danger, but I could still hear the voices coming from somewhere near the visitor center. I followed the sound, moving carefully through knee-deep snow and using my flashlight to avoid obstacles buried under the drifts. The voices seemed to be coming from the area around the main visitor center building, but as I got closer, they seemed to move away, always staying just at the edge of my hearing range. I spent nearly an hour searching through the storm, following the voices as they led me in a rough circle around the RIM facilities. My flashlight beam revealed nothing but wind-blown snow and the dark shapes of buildings and trees. There were no footprints, no signs that anyone else had been moving through the area. But the voices continued, always just ahead of me, always just out of reach. Eventually, the cold forced me to give up the search and return to the staff quarters. I was shivering uncontrollably, and I knew I was risking frostbite by staying outside any longer. But as I reached the door to our building, I heard something that confirmed my worst fears. The voices were now coming from behind me, discussing my search in the same hushed tones they had used earlier. "He knows we are here," one voice said. "What should we do about that?" asked another. The conversation continued, but I could not make out the rest as I fumbled with the door lock and rushed inside to the warmth and safety of the building. The next morning, I told my supervisor everything that had happened during my late-night search. I expected him to be concerned about my mental state, or at least worried that I was suffering from severe cabin fever. Instead, he listened with a grim expression that suggested he knew more than he had been willing to share previously. When I finished my account, he was quiet for several minutes, staring out the window at the snow-covered landscape around the lake. Finally, he turned back to me and said that I was not the first maintenance worker to report hearing voices during winter assignments at Crater Lake. Over the years, several other employees had described similar experiences, always during the most severe weather, always during the deepest isolation of the winter months. He explained that the Park Service had never been able to find any explanation for the reports. There were no records of unauthorized people in the park during winter closures, no evidence of camps or shelters that might house individuals living off the grid. The voices seemed to appear only during the worst weather, when conditions would make survival nearly impossible for anyone caught outside without proper shelter. Some employees had theorized that the voices were related to the tragic history of Crater Lake, where numerous people had died over the years in accidents, suicides, and disappearances. The extreme isolation and harsh winter conditions might somehow amplify psychic impressions left by those who had perished at the lake. Others suggested that the voices might be connected to the Native American legends about Crater Lake being a gateway to the spirit world. but my supervisor also shared a more disturbing possibility that had been discussed among long-term park employees. There had been reports, never officially confirmed, of people living in the wilderness areas around Crater Lake during winter months. Individuals who had chosen to disconnect entirely from civilized society, surviving in conditions that would kill most people within hours. These hypothetical hermits would have intimate knowledge of the park layout, the location of maintenance facilities, and the schedules followed by winter crews. They might observe park employees from a distance, gathering information for reasons no one could understand. The harsh winter conditions would make detection nearly impossible, as their tracks would be quickly covered by snow and wind. The conversation with my supervisor did nothing to ease my fears about what I had been hearing. If anything, it made the situation worse by confirming that other people had experienced similar encounters. I was not losing my mind, but I was also not dealing with anything that had a rational explanation. Over the remaining weeks of my winter assignment, I continued to hear the voices on a regular basis. They seemed to be monitoring our activities, discussing our work schedules and personal habits with an attention to detail that was deeply unsettling. I began to feel like I was living under constant surveillance, watched by unseen observers who knew everything about my daily routine. The voices followed me when I worked alone in remote areas of the park, always staying just out of sight but close enough to make their presence known. They seemed to know when I was carrying my radio and when I was beyond the range of communication with other park employees. During those times, their conversations became more detailed and more threatening. On one particularly disturbing occasion, I heard them discussing the layout of the staff quarters, including specific details about which rooms were occupied and which were empty. They knew where I slept, where I kept my personal belongings, and what my work schedule would be for the following week. The level of surveillance implied by their knowledge was terrifying. I began taking precautions that would have seemed paranoid under normal circumstances. I varied my work routes and schedules as much as possible. I never worked alone in remote areas without first checking in with other crew members. I kept emergency supplies with me at all times, including extra food, water, and cold weather gear. But the voices seemed to adapt to my precautions, always staying one step ahead of my attempts to avoid them. They began appearing in areas where I had never heard them before, including inside park buildings where they should not have been able to operate without being detected by other employees. The final incident occurred during my last week at the lake. I was conducting a routine inspection of the visitor center heating system when I heard voices coming from somewhere inside the building. They were discussing a plan to approach me directly, to make contact rather than simply observing from a distance. I immediately radioed my supervisor and requested backup. But by the time another crew member arrived, the voices had stopped. A thorough search of the building revealed no signs of intruders, no evidence that anyone had been inside who should not have been there. My supervisor arranged for me to leave the park 2 days early, officially due to a family emergency, but actually because he was concerned about my psychological state. I was relieved to go, and I have never returned to Crater Lake for a winter assignment. I still do not know what I was hearing during those weeks of isolation at the lake. The official explanation is that extreme stress and sensory deprivation caused me to experience auditory hallucinations. But I know the difference between imagination and reality, and what I heard was real. There is something in the wilderness around Crater Lake that watches and waits during the winter months. Something that knows the park better than the people who work there. Something that monitors human activity with an intelligence and purpose that defies explanation. Whether it is living people who have chosen to exist outside civilized society or something else entirely, I cannot say. All I know is that Crater Lake is not as empty during the winter as it appears to be. There are observers in those snow-covered forests, watchers who know your every move and discuss your activities in hushed, urgent voices that carry on the winter wind. I have transferred to a different park, one that does not require winter isolation assignments. I sleep better now knowing that I am not being watched by unseen eyes or discussed by voices that should not exist. But sometimes, on cold winter nights when the wind is howling outside my window, I think I can still hear them calling my name. Most people do not know that Portland sits on top of hundreds of miles of forgotten tunnels and abandoned spaces. I made it my mission to explore every single one of them, until I found something down there that was exploring me back. My name is Madison, and for 3 years I have been documenting the hidden underground network that runs beneath the city. What started as a hobby became an obsession, and eventually became a nightmare that I am still trying to forget. I discovered urban exploration during my second year at Portland State University. A friend mentioned the Shanghai tunnels, those infamous passages that supposedly ran beneath Old Town. Most people dismissed them as tourist folklore, but I was intrigued by the possibility that an entire hidden world existed right under our feet. I started researching the history, mapping the known entrances, and planning my first descent into the underground. The initial explorations were incredible. I found myself in forgotten basements, abandoned utility tunnels, and steam passages that had been sealed off for decades. Each discovery felt like uncovering a piece of Portland history that had been deliberately hidden from the world above. I documented everything with photographs and detailed notes, creating maps of the underground network that grew more complex with each expedition. I developed techniques for accessing the tunnels safely. I learned to pick locks, to read architectural plans, and to identify which manholes led to active infrastructure versus abandoned passages. I invested in professional equipment including headlamps, climbing gear, and waterproof cameras. I established rules for myself, never exploring alone, always leaving detailed plans with friends and maintaining emergency communication protocols. But as my explorations became more ambitious, I began to bend those safety rules. The most interesting discoveries always seemed to require solo missions into areas that other urban explorers avoided. I told myself that my experience made me capable of handling situations that would be dangerous for beginners. I was wrong about that, and my arrogance nearly cost me everything. The incident happened in early March during an exploration of a tunnel system beneath the industrial district on the east side. I had been mapping this particular network for weeks, working methodically through connected passages that seemed to extend much farther than any official records indicated. The tunnels were old, probably dating back to the early 1900s, with brick walls and arched ceilings that showed the craftsmanship of a different era. I was about 2 hours into the exploration, working my way through a section that I had never accessed before, when I noticed something unusual. The tunnels in this area showed signs of recent activity. There were fresh footprints in the dust, improvised lighting fixtures strung along the walls, and crude furniture made from salvaged materials. Someone was living down there, and they had been for quite some time. My first instinct was to turn back immediately. Encountering homeless camps in urban exploration was not uncommon, but it required extreme caution. These were people who had been pushed to the margins of society, and they often viewed explorers as threats to their safety and security. I knew the smart thing to do was to retreat and find a different route for my mapping project. But curiosity got the better of me. The living space was more elaborate than anything I had seen before. There were multiple rooms connected by carefully maintained passages with evidence of electrical work and plumbing modifications that must have required considerable skill and planning. This was not a temporary shelter, but a permanent underground community that had somehow remained hidden from city authorities. I continued deeper into the inhabited section, moving as quietly as possible and documenting everything with my camera. The construction was impressive, with reinforced walls, drainage systems, and ventilation shafts that had been carefully integrated into the existing tunnel structure. Whoever lived here had spent years developing this space, and they clearly intended to stay. That was when I heard the voices. They were coming from somewhere ahead of me, echoing through the passages in a way that made it impossible to determine their exact location or distance. I immediately turned off my headlamp and pressed myself against the tunnel wall, trying to become invisible in the darkness. The voices were male, at least 2 different speakers, and they were discussing something in urgent, hushed tones. I could not make out the specific words, but the tone was definitely threatening. They were angry about something, and that anger seemed to be directed at an intruder in their space. It took me several seconds to realize that they were talking about me. They knew I was there, and they were planning to do something about it. I started moving back toward the way I had come, but the voices seemed to be getting closer. The tunnel acoustics made it impossible to determine which direction they were approaching from, and I realized that I might have already been cut off from my planned escape route. I was in their territory, surrounded by people who viewed my presence as a direct threat to their safety and security. I found a side passage that I had not explored and decided to hide there until the voices moved away. But as I crouched in the darkness, I began to hear other sounds that made my situation much worse. There were more voices coming from different directions, and they seemed to be coordinating some kind of search pattern. They were not just looking for me, they were hunting me. The realization that I was being systematically tracked through the tunnel system triggered a panic response that I had never experienced before. My heart was racing. My breathing became rapid and shallow, and my hands were shaking so badly that I could barely operate my equipment. I was trapped underground with an unknown number of people who clearly meant me harm, and I had no way to call for help. I forced myself to stay calm and think strategically about my situation. I had been mapping these tunnels for weeks, so I knew the general layout better than I would have in a completely unfamiliar location. There were multiple exit points, and if I could avoid the search parties, I might be able to reach one of them before being caught. But I would have to move quickly and quietly, and I could not afford to make any mistakes. I started moving through the side passages, using my knowledge of the tunnel layout to stay ahead of the voices. But the underground community clearly knew their territory much better than I did. Every time I thought I had found a clear path to an exit, I would hear voices blocking that route. They were forcing me deeper into the tunnel system, away from the exits I knew about and into areas that I had never explored. The hunt continued for what felt like hours. I moved through passage after passage, always listening for voices, always looking for a way out that was not being watched. My equipment was running low on battery power, and I knew that once my lights failed, I would be completely helpless in the darkness. The psychological pressure was overwhelming, and I began to make increasingly desperate decisions. I found myself in a section of tunnel that was partially flooded, with several inches of standing water covering the floor. The water was ice cold and had a smell that suggested it was not just groundwater, but sewage or industrial runoff that had been accumulating for years. I waded through it anyway, hoping that the searchers would be reluctant to follow me into such unpleasant conditions. The flooded section led to a junction with several branching passages, and for the first time in hours, I could not hear any voices nearby. I chose the passage that seemed to angle upward, hoping it would lead me back towards street level and a possible exit. But after following it for several hundred yards, I found myself at a dead end with no way forward. I was forced to backtrack through the flooded section, and when I reached the junction again, I could hear voices approaching from multiple directions. They had found my trail through the water, and they were closing in on my position. I had nowhere left to run, and my battery power was nearly exhausted. In desperation, I found a drainage pipe that was just large enough for me to crawl through. It was a tight fit, and the pipe was filled with debris and standing water, but it was my only option. I turned off my headlamp to conserve what little battery power remained and began crawling through complete darkness, guided only by the feel of the pipe walls around me. The pipe seemed to go on forever. My knees and elbows were scraped raw from crawling over rough concrete and metal debris. The water soaked through my clothes, and the cold began to affect my coordination and judgment. Several times I became stuck and had to force myself through openings that seemed too small for my body. But eventually I saw light ahead of me. The pipe opened into a storm drain that led to a culvert under a busy street. I could hear traffic above me, and I knew that I was finally close to escape. I crawled the last few yards and emerged into daylight, covered in filth and shaking from cold and exhaustion. I found myself in an industrial area on the east side of the river, several miles from where I had entered the tunnel system. I was disoriented and exhausted, but I was alive and free. I walked to the nearest business and called a friend to pick me up, making up a story about a bicycle accident to explain my condition. I never returned to urban exploration after that day. The experience taught me that there are spaces beneath the city that belong to people who have been forgotten by the world above, and those people will defend their territory with whatever means they have available. I had been lucky to escape, and I knew that luck would not protect me a second time. Sometimes I still think about the underground community I discovered. I wonder who they were, how they ended up living in those tunnels, and whether they are still there. But I will never try to find out. There are some secrets that are meant to remain hidden, and some places where outsiders are not welcome. The tunnels beneath Portland are vast and complex, full of history and mystery. But they are also home to people who have nowhere else to go, and those people deserve to be left in peace. Urban exploration taught me to respect the spaces I visited, and sometimes that respect means knowing when to stay away. In 22 years of Oregon State Police work, I have handled everything from domestic disputes to homicides. But what I encountered on Highway 101 near Bandon defied every protocol I had ever learned. My name is Tyler, and after 2 decades of law enforcement, I thought I had seen every type of criminal behavior and emergency situation that could occur on Oregon's highways. I was wrong about that, and what happened during my patrol shift last November still keeps me awake at night. Highway 101 runs along the entire Oregon coast, connecting small towns and tourist destinations through some of the most beautiful but also most isolated stretches of road in the Pacific Northwest. During the off-season, particularly in late fall and winter, traffic on the highway drops to almost nothing. You can drive for hours without seeing another vehicle, especially on the remote sections between Bandon and Gold Beach, where the road winds through dense forest and rocky coastline. I had been working the Coastal Patrol for 8 years, covering the stretch of Highway 101 from Coos Bay to the California border. It was generally quiet work, mostly involving traffic stops for speeding tourists and the occasional accident during storms when visibility dropped to near zero. The most serious incidents I typically dealt with were drunk drivers heading home from the coastal casinos and domestic disputes at some of the more isolated beach houses. The incident began during what should have been a routine patrol shift on a foggy November evening. I was driving southbound near Bandon around 10:30 in the evening when I received a radio call about a stranded motorist approximately 15 miles ahead of my position. The caller had used a cell phone to contact dispatch, reporting that their vehicle had broken down and that they were parked on the shoulder of the highway, waiting for assistance. This type of call was common along Highway 101, especially during the rainy season when older vehicles frequently experienced mechanical problems. My standard procedure was to respond to the location, assess the situation, and either provide assistance or coordinate with a tow truck company to get the stranded vehicle off the highway. As I drove toward the reported location, I noticed that the fog was becoming increasingly dense, reducing visibility to less than 50 feet in some areas. This was also typical for the Oregon coast during fall and winter, when warm ocean air collided with cooler land temperatures to create thick marine layers that could persist for hours. When I reached the coordinates provided by dispatch, I found no sign of a stranded vehicle or motorist. I parked my patrol car on the shoulder and activated my emergency lights, then began searching the immediate area for any evidence that someone had been there recently. I checked both sides of the highway, looked for tire tracks in the soft shoulder, and used my flashlight to examine the ditch areas where a vehicle might have gone off the road. After 20 minutes of searching, I radioed dispatch to report that I had found no trace of the reported stranded motorist. The dispatcher confirmed the coordinates and suggested that the caller might have been confused about their exact location, which was also common in areas where cell phone coverage was spotty and GPS signals could be unreliable. I was preparing to expand my search to adjacent areas when I noticed headlights approaching from the north. As the vehicle got closer, I could see that it was moving unusually slowly, barely maintaining highway speed despite the fact that this particular section of road was straight and relatively safe even in foggy conditions. The vehicle passed my position without stopping, which struck me as odd since most drivers would at least slow down or pull over when they saw a patrol car with emergency lights activated. As the tail lights disappeared into the fog ahead of me, I decided to follow and conduct a routine traffic stop to see if the driver was experiencing problems or needed assistance. I caught up with the vehicle after about 2 miles, but when I activated my overhead lights to signal the driver to pull over, the car did not respond. It continued traveling at the same slow speed, maintaining its position in the right lane without acknowledging my presence. I radioed in my position and license plate number, but dispatch reported that the plate did not match any vehicle in their database. Over the next several miles, I followed the vehicle while repeatedly activating my siren and using my public address system to instruct the driver to pull over. The car showed no response to any of my attempts to make contact, continuing to travel at exactly 35 miles per hour, despite the posted speed limit of 55 miles per hour. As we continued south, I began to notice other unusual aspects of the situation. The vehicle itself appeared to be an older model sedan, possibly from the 1980s or early 1990s, but it was in remarkably good condition despite its apparent age. The taillights were bright and clear, the body showed no signs of rust or damage, and the exhaust was clean without any visible smoke or emissions. More disturbing, I could not see any occupants inside the vehicle despite being directly behind it, with my headlights providing illumination through the rear window. The car appeared to be driving itself, maintaining perfect lane control and consistent speed without any visible human intervention. After following the vehicle for nearly 10 miles, I made the decision to attempt a pit maneuver to force it to stop. This was an extreme measure, but I was growing increasingly concerned about the safety implications of a vehicle that was not responding to law enforcement signals and appeared to be operating without a driver. I positioned my patrol car alongside the rear quarter panel of the suspect vehicle and began to execute the maneuver. But at the moment of contact, something impossible happened. My patrol car passed directly through the other vehicle as if it were not there at all. I felt no impact, heard no sound of collision, and experienced no change in my vehicle's momentum or direction. I immediately pulled over to the side of the highway, my hands shaking as I tried to process what had just occurred. I sat in my patrol car for several minutes, checking my equipment and trying to determine if I was experiencing some kind of medical emergency or equipment malfunction that might explain what I had witnessed. I radioed dispatch to request backup and medical assistance explaining that I was experiencing a situation that I could not adequately describe or understand. The dispatcher asked if I was injured or in immediate danger, and I honestly did not know how to answer. I was physically unharmed, but I was deeply shaken by an encounter that violated every law of physics and reality that I understood. While I waited for backup to arrive, I conducted a thorough inspection of my patrol car, looking for any sign of damage that might indicate I had actually collided with another vehicle. I found no evidence of impact, no scratches or dents, and no debris that might have come from another car. According to all physical evidence, I had not made contact with anything during my attempted PIT maneuver. When backup arrived 30 minutes later, I explained the situation to Sergeant Rodriguez, a 25-year veteran of the state police who had worked the coastal patrol longer than anyone in our unit. He listened to my account with a serious expression, asking detailed questions about the vehicle's appearance, behavior, and my attempts to make contact. When I finished my report, Rodriguez was quiet for several minutes before telling me something that changed my understanding of the entire incident. He explained that I was not the first officer to report encounters with phantom vehicles on Highway 101, particularly in the area between Bandon and Gold Beach where my incident had occurred. Over the years, several other officers had described similar experiences involving vehicles that appeared normal at first glance but exhibited impossible behavior when subjected to closer examination. These vehicles never responded to traffic stops, never pulled over despite extended pursuit, and sometimes seemed to vanish entirely when officers attempted to make physical contact. Rodriguez told me that the department had an unofficial policy of not discussing these incidents publicly, partly to avoid ridicule and partly because there was no rational explanation for what officers were witnessing. The reports were filed and documented, but no further investigation was conducted because there was no evidence of criminal activity and no apparent threat to public safety. He also shared some historical context that made the situation even more unsettling. The stretch of Highway 101 where these incidents occurred had been the site of numerous fatal accidents over the decades, including several cases where drivers had simply disappeared along with their vehicles. Search and rescue operations had found no trace of the missing drivers or cars despite extensive efforts involving multiple agencies and volunteer groups. Some of the missing persons cases dated back to the 1960s and 1970s when Highway 101 was even more isolated and dangerous than it is today. Families had reported that their loved ones had failed to arrive at their destinations after traveling this route, but no evidence was ever found to indicate what had happened to them. Rodriguez suggested that what I had encountered might be connected to these historical disappearances, though he admitted that he had no explanation for how such a connection might be possible. He recommended that I file a complete report of the incident, but advised me not to discuss it with other officers or civilians who might not understand the unique challenges of coastal patrol work. I followed his advice and filed a detailed report, but I also began conducting my own research into the history of Highway 101 and the missing persons cases that Rodriguez had mentioned. What I discovered was even more disturbing than the original incident. Over the past 50 years, at least 17 people had disappeared while traveling the section of Highway 101 between Bandon and Gold Beach. Their vehicles had never been found, despite extensive searches of the coastline, forest areas, and remote roads in the region. In several cases, witnesses had reported seeing the missing person's vehicle on the highway after they were supposed to have reached their destination, but these sightings were generally dismissed as cases of mistaken identity. Reading through these historical accounts, I began to wonder if what I had encountered was not a phantom vehicle, but rather evidence of some ongoing phenomenon that had been claiming travelers on this stretch of highway for decades. Perhaps the people who disappeared were still somehow present on the road, continuing their journeys in a form that was visible but not quite real. I requested a transfer to a different patrol area 6 months after the incident. I told my supervisors that I wanted new challenges and opportunities for professional development. But the truth was that I could no longer patrol Highway 101 without thinking about what I had encountered that foggy November night. I still drive the coastal highway occasionally when visiting family or taking vacation trips, but I am always aware of the other vehicles around me in ways I never was before. Sometimes, late at night when the fog is thick and visibility is poor, I think I see familiar taillights in my mirrors, always maintaining that same impossibly consistent speed and distance. I know that some of my fellow officers think I experienced a hallucination or some kind of stress-related episode. But I also know what I saw, and I know that Highway 101 holds secrets that go far beyond anything covered in police training or protocol manuals. The Oregon coast is beautiful, but it is also dangerous, and some of that danger cannot be addressed by conventional law enforcement methods. All I can do is continue serving and protecting to the best of my ability, while remaining aware that there are forces at work on these remote highways that I will never fully understand. I have been part of Mount Hood's search and rescue team for 6 years, and we have saved dozens of lives in those mountains. But our last mission in the wilderness area near Government Camp was not about saving anyone. It was about surviving what we found up there. My name is Brandon, and what happened during our February 2024 rescue operation changed my understanding of what exists in the high country around Oregon's most dangerous peak. Mount Hood is one of the most climbed mountains in North America, attracting thousands of hikers and climbers every year. It is also one of the most deadly, with an average of 3 to 4 fatalities annually, and dozens of rescue operations. Our team, Pacific Northwest Search and Rescue, responds to calls from county sheriffs when people go missing or get injured in the backcountry areas around the mountain. The mission began with a standard distress call on February 15th. A group of 3 experienced backcountry skiers had failed to return from a planned 2-day trip into the Government Camp wilderness area. Their emergency locator beacon had activated around 4:30 p.m., indicating they were in serious trouble somewhere in the vast expanse of forest and alpine terrain on the mountain's southwest slopes. Weather conditions were challenging but not impossible. Fresh snow had fallen during the previous 48 hours and temperatures were well below freezing. But visibility was good and winds were relatively calm. We assembled a team of 8 volunteers, including myself as team leader, and began organizing our search strategy based on the beacon's last known coordinates. The missing skiers were all local residents with extensive backcountry experience. Tom Bradley, 34, was a certified ski instructor who had been exploring Mount Hood's wilderness areas for over 10 years. Sarah Chen, 29, was an emergency room nurse who regularly participated in avalanche rescue training. Mark Stevens, 41, was a professional mountain guide who had summited Mount Hood more than 20 times. These were not inexperienced tourists who had gotten in over their heads. They were skilled outdoors enthusiasts who knew how to handle themselves in dangerous situations. The fact that their emergency beacon had been activated suggested they were dealing with something serious, possibly a severe injury or avalanche burial that prevented them from self-rescuing. We began our search at first light on February 16th, using snowmobiles to access the general area where the beacon signal had originated. The terrain in that section of Mount Hood is extremely challenging, with steep slopes, deep ravines, and dense forests that can hide hazards like tree wells and unstable snow conditions. The initial phase of our search followed standard protocols. We divided into 2 teams and began working systematic search patterns, using avalanche probes and rescue dogs to check areas where the missing skiers might be buried under snow. We also used GPS units to precisely navigate to the coordinates provided by their emergency beacon. After 4 hours of intensive searching, we found their camp. The 3 skiers had established a well-organized base camp in a sheltered area near a grove of large pine trees. Their tents were properly set up, their equipment was neatly arranged, and there were no signs of avalanche activity or other natural disasters that might explain their disappearance. But the camp had clearly been abandoned in a hurry. Food was still cooking on their camp stove, personal belongings were scattered around the site, and their sleeping bags were thrown aside as if they had been sleeping when something forced them to leave immediately. Most disturbing, we found clear evidence that they had left the camp during the night, in sub-zero temperatures and dangerous conditions that no experienced backcountry traveler would willingly venture into. We followed their tracks leading away from the camp and immediately realized that something was very wrong. The tracks showed that all 3 skiers had been moving together in a tight group, but they were not following any logical route towards safety. Instead, they appeared to be heading deeper into the wilderness, toward terrain that was more dangerous and further from any possible rescue or shelter. The tracks also showed signs that the skiers had been moving unusually fast, almost running on their skis despite poor visibility and hazardous conditions. There were several places where 1 or more of them had fallen, but they had gotten up immediately and continued moving in the same direction, as if they were fleeing from something behind them. After following the trail for nearly 2 miles, we came to an area where the tracks suddenly stopped. Not gradually, as if the skiers had removed their skis to continue on foot, but abruptly in the middle of an open slope where there was no logical reason for them to change direction or method of travel. The snow around the end of the ski tracks was disturbed in ways that we could not explain. There were marks and impressions that did not match any equipment the skiers had been carrying, and the snow itself seemed to have been compressed by something much heavier than 3 people on skis. We spent the rest of that day expanding our search in all directions from where the tracks ended, but we found no further sign of the missing skiers. We used avalanche probes to check for possible burial sites, thermal imaging equipment to look for body heat signatures, and trained search dogs to try to pick up human scent traces. As evening approached, we established our own camp near the location where the ski tracks had ended. Standard protocol for multi-day search operations required us to maintain a base camp that could serve as a command post and staging area for continued searching. We set up our tents, prepared hot meals, and organized watch schedules for the night. It was during the first watch, around 11:30 p.m., that we encountered the phenomena that transformed our rescue mission into something entirely different. I was on duty with Jake Morrison, a veteran rescue volunteer with over 15 years of mountain experience, when we first heard the sounds. They started as distant voices, barely audible over the wind through the pine trees. At first, we assumed they were coming from other members of our team, perhaps talking quietly in their tents. But when we checked, we found that everyone else was asleep and the voices were coming from somewhere outside our camp. The voices sounded like people calling for help, which would have been consistent with finding the missing skiers. But there was something wrong with the calls. They seemed to come from multiple directions simultaneously, and they had an echoing quality that did not match the acoustics of the area where we were camped. Jake and I grabbed our flashlights and emergency medical supplies and began moving toward the source of the voices, following standard procedures for responding to calls for help in the wilderness. But as we got closer to where the sounds seemed to be coming from, they would move, always staying just at the edge of our hearing range. We spent nearly an hour following the voices through the forest, but we never found anyone who might have been calling for help. The sounds led us in a rough circle around our camp, always seeming to come from just ahead of us, but never getting closer or more distinct. When we returned to camp, we discovered that our tents had been moved. Not dramatically, and not in a way that suggested deliberate vandalism, but they were definitely in different positions than where we had set them up earlier in the evening. Our equipment had also been rearranged, with items moved from their original locations and placed in neat piles that none of our team members remembered creating. The other members of our search team had been awakened by the disturbance, and they had their own reports of unusual activity. Several people described feeling as if they were being watched while trying to sleep, and 2 team members reported seeing figures moving between the trees just outside the circle of light cast by our camp lanterns. We conducted a thorough perimeter check looking for any evidence of who might have been in our camp while Jake and I were following the voices. We found footprints in the snow around our tents, but they were not from any of our team members. The prints appeared to be from bare feet, which made no sense given the sub-zero temperatures and deep snow conditions. At that point, we made the decision to terminate the search operation and evacuate our team from the mountain. As experienced rescue volunteers, we were trained to recognize when conditions had become too dangerous to continue, and the unexplained activity around our camp clearly represented a threat to our safety. But our evacuation was complicated by equipment failures that had not been present earlier in the mission. Our GPS units began providing inconsistent readings, making it difficult to navigate back to our vehicles. Our radio communications with base camp became intermittent and filled with static. Even our emergency backup equipment seemed to be affected by whatever was causing the other malfunctions. The return trip to our staging area took nearly twice as long as expected, as we were forced to rely on compass navigation and visual landmarks to find our way through terrain that several of our team members had traveled many times before. Throughout the descent, we continued to hear the voices calling from various locations around us, but we made no attempt to investigate or respond. When we finally reached our vehicles and re-established communication with county emergency services, we learned that the search for the 3 missing skiers had been called off. Their bodies had been found early that morning by a different search team working in an area more than 5 miles from where we had been searching. The circumstances of their deaths raised questions that were never adequately answered. All 3 bodies were found together in a location that made no logical sense given the evidence we had found at their camp and along their ski trail. They appeared to have died from exposure, but they were discovered without any of their survival equipment, including the heavy winter clothing they had been wearing when they left their camp. Most disturbing, the location where their bodies were found was accessible only by traveling through terrain that would have been extremely difficult and dangerous to navigate at night, especially without proper equipment. There was no explanation for how or why they had made such a journey, or what had happened to their skis, packs, and other gear. The official incident report concluded that the 3 skiers had become disoriented during the night and had made poor decisions that led to their deaths from exposure. But those of us who had been involved in the search knew that the explanation did not account for the evidence we had observed or the unusual phenomena we had encountered. I submitted a detailed report describing everything our team had experienced during the search operation, but I was advised by county officials that such details would not be helpful to the families of the deceased and might create unnecessary public concern about safety in the Mount Hood Wilderness area. I have not participated in any search and rescue operations on Mount Hood since that mission. I transferred to a team that works primarily in lower elevation areas, telling my supervisors that I wanted to focus on urban rescue operations. But the truth is that I can no longer feel comfortable in the high country around Mount Hood, knowing that there are things up there that do not have rational explanations. The mountain continues to attract thousands of climbers and hikers every year in search, and rescue teams continue to respond when people get into trouble in the wilderness areas. But I know that some of the dangers they face cannot be addressed by training, equipment, or experience, and that Mount Hood holds secrets that go far beyond the well-documented risks of avalanches, weather, and difficult terrain. Sometimes the people who go missing in those mountains encounter something other than natural hazards, and sometimes the rescue teams sent to find them discover that they are not alone in the wilderness after all.